Hey there, my amazing friends. Before we jump into today's video, I really need a little help from you. The channel is going through a rough patch, and your support truly matters. Let's try to reach 1,000 likes and 1,000 comments. If everyone watching gives just one like and writes a comment, we can make it happen easily. And remember to subscribe if you haven't yet. Alright, let's get started. Thank you so much for being here and supporting me. It means the world. You've been a park ranger at Howling Pines National Forest for 8 years now. And you thought you'd seen everything these Michigan woods could throw at you. Lost hikers, illegal campers, the occasional bear encounter, drunk teenagers thinking they're invincible, all part of the job. But nothing prepared you for the summer of 2024, when people started disappearing without a trace. The first was Carter Williams, a 23-year-old from Grand Rapids, who'd come up for a solo camping trip in June. His campsite at Cedar Lake was found perfectly intact, tent still staked, food still hanging in the bear canister, boots neatly placed outside the tent flap. The only signs of disturbance were the massive paw prints circling the site, too large for any known animal in Michigan. Then Cash Morrison vanished in July. The 35-year-old father of two had been fly fishing along Whisper Creek when his wife Emily called 911. She'd heard him screaming from their cabin a quarter mile away. Not the kind of scream you make when you snag your line or slip on wet rocks. This was pure terror, she told you during the interview, her hands shaking as she poured coffee neither of you would drink. It went on for maybe 30 seconds, Emily said, staring out the cabin window toward the creek. Then nothing. Just silence. You'd organized the search parties yourself, combing every inch of the forest for 3 days. All you found was Cash's fishing rod snapped in half, and his tackle box scattered like something had batted it around with incredible force. The tracks you found nearby defied explanation, canine in shape but easily twice the size of the largest wolf track you'd ever seen, with claw marks that gouged deep into the earth. By August, the disappearances were making national news. Remy Patterson, a marine biology student from Michigan State, had been collecting water samples for her thesis when she simply vanished. Her research equipment was found floating in Whisper Creek, along with her field notebook, every page torn to shreds. The media dubbed it the Howling Pines Mystery, sending reporters and amateur investigators flooding into your forest. You spent more time managing crowds than actually investigating, watching helplessly as evidence got trampled and contaminated. The pressure from above was mounting too. State officials wanted answers, families wanted closure, and you had nothing to give them but oversized paw prints and theories that sounded insane even to yourself. That's when you started staying late at the ranger station, poring over incident reports from decades past. What you found in the dusty filing cabinets made your blood run cold. Missing persons cases stretching back to the 1940s, all following the same pattern. Campers, hikers, fishermen, all vanishing without a trace, leaving behind only signs of struggle and those impossible tracks. The old-timers in the area had a name for what took them: Dogman. Most of the reports dismissed it as local folklore, the kind of legend that grows around any dense forest. But the consistency was disturbing. Descriptions from survivors and witnesses going back generations all painted the same picture. A massive creature, part man and part wolf, standing upright on powerful hind legs. 7 feet tall or more, covered in dark fur, with glowing yellow eyes and fangs that could crush bone. You'd always prided yourself on being rational, scientific. You believed in facts, evidence, logical explanations. But as September arrived and the disappearances continued, rationality was becoming a luxury you couldn't afford. Zane Cooper, an experienced woodsman and hunting guide, had vanished just 2 days ago. His hunting party found his rifle torn in half, the metal barrel twisted like a pretzel. Tonight, you're alone in the station, spreading out topographical maps and marking every disappearance with red pins. The pattern is unmistakable. They're all clustered around the deepest, most remote sections of the forest, areas where the old-growth pines block out most of the sunlight and create a perpetual twilight beneath their branches. A sound from outside makes you look up from the maps. It's barely audible through the station's thick walls, but unmistakably organic. Not the bark of a coyote or the howl of a wolf, something else entirely. Something that makes your skin crawl and your hand instinctively reach for the service weapon on your belt. The sound comes again, closer this time. A low, rumbling growl that seems to vibrate through the very foundation of the building. You move to the window, peering out into the darkness beyond the station's floodlights. The forest looks innocent enough, just shadows and moonlight painting everything in shades of gray. But you know better now. You know what's out there in those shadows hunting. Your radio crackles to life, making you jump. It's Omar Rodriguez, your colleague working the night shift at the north entrance. "Hey, you still at the station?" Omar's voice carries an edge of concern. "I'm getting some weird calls from campers at Devil's Backbone campground. They're reporting strange noises, something moving around the perimeter of the camp." You grab the radio, your mouth suddenly dry. Devil's Backbone is one of the remotest campgrounds in the park, surrounded by miles of dense forest. If the creature is there now, those campers are sitting ducks. "How many people are we talking about?" you ask, already reaching for your gear. "Maybe 15, 20 people total, mostly families with kids." Omar pauses. "Should I call the state police?" You consider it. The state police have been cooperative, but they're stretched thin across multiple counties, and their response time to Devil's Backbone would be at least an hour. Those families don't have an hour if your worst fears are correct. "Negative," you say, clipping the radio to your belt. "I'm heading out there now. Keep monitoring the radio and call for backup if you don't hear from me within 2 hours." "Roger that. Be careful out there." You load your truck with everything you might need. Flares, emergency medical supplies, your heavy-duty flashlight, and extra ammunition for your sidearm. As you drive through the winding forest roads toward Devil's Backbone, you can't shake the feeling that you're driving toward a confrontation that's been years in the making. The headlights of your truck pierce the darkness ahead, but the forest seems to press in from all sides, creating a tunnel of shadows that swallows your light. Every now and then, you catch a glimpse of movement in your peripheral vision, something large and dark keeping pace with your vehicle through the trees. By the time you reach Devil's Backbone, you're gripping the steering wheel so tightly, your knuckles have gone white. The campground appears peaceful at first glance. Several tents are scattered around the area, with a few RVs parked near the main loop. Campfires are still burning, casting dancing shadows on the surrounding trees. But something's wrong. It's too quiet. No voices, no sounds of activity that you'd expect from a campground full of families. Even the insects have fallen silent, as if the entire forest is holding its breath. You park near the campground entrance and step out of your truck, your hand resting on your weapon. The smell hits you immediately, something wild and predatory, like wet dog mixed with something fouler, something that doesn't belong in these woods. A child's scream pierces the silence, high and terrified, coming from somewhere deeper in the campground. Then another scream, and another, as panic spreads through the camp like wildfire. You break into a run, your flashlight beam dancing wildly as you sprint toward the sounds of terror. Whatever's happening, you're about to come face to face with the thing that's been haunting Howling Pines for decades. The thing they call Dog Man. The screaming leads you to the far end of the campground, where the forest presses closest to the campsites. Your flashlight beam sweeps across overturned picnic tables and scattered camping gear as you run, the chaos telling a story of people fleeing in blind panic. You find them huddled together near the restroom building, maybe a dozen campers, adults clutching children, everyone wild-eyed with terror. Emerson Blake, a man in his 40s wearing a Michigan State t-shirt, spots your ranger uniform and rushes toward you. "Thank God you're here," he gasps, pointing toward a cluster of tents that have been shredded to ribbons. "That thing took Knox and his family. Just grabbed them and dragged them into the woods. We tried to stop it, but..." He trails off, staring at your service weapon. Even in the darkness, you can see the hopelessness in his eyes. Whatever he saw out there, a pistol seems laughably inadequate. "How long ago?" you ask, helping a crying woman to her feet. Her name tag reads Rory. Probably a teacher, considering the Jefferson Elementary logo on her jacket. Maybe 10 minutes, Emerson says. We called 911, but they said it would be at least an hour before anyone could get here. You nod, doing quick mental calculations. Knox and his family could still be alive, but not for long if the pattern holds. The thing you're hunting doesn't keep prisoners, it kills quickly and efficiently, then drags the bodies away to wherever it lairs. I need everyone to get in their vehicles right now, you say, raising your voice to address the entire group. Drive to the ranger station and wait there. Don't stop for anything. Don't get out of your cars until you reach the main road. What about Knox? Asks Marco Gutierrez, a young man with blood on his t-shirt, probably from trying to help during the attack. We can't just leave them. I'm going after them, you say, checking your gear one more time. But I need you people safe first. That thing might come back. As the survivors pack into their vehicles, you study the scene of the attack more carefully. Knox's campsite looks like it was hit by a tornado. The family tent is completely destroyed, support poles snapped like toothpicks. Deep gouges in the earth show where massive claws found purchase as something incredibly strong dragged its prey toward the tree line. The tracks are the clearest you've seen yet. Definitely canine, but impossibly large. Each paw print is nearly a foot long, with claw marks extending several inches beyond the pads. The stride length suggests something moving on two legs, covering ground with the efficiency of a predator born to hunt. You follow the trail into the forest, your flashlight creating a narrow cone of visibility in the oppressive darkness. The tracks lead deeper into the wilderness, toward the heart of howling pines where the trees grow so thick that daylight barely penetrates even at noon. Behind you, you hear car engines starting as the survivors follow your instructions. At least they'll be safe. Now you just have to pray you're not too late for Knox and his family. The forest grows denser as you follow the trail, branches catching at your uniform and forcing you to duck under low-hanging limbs. The creature's path is easy to follow. Broken branches, disturbed undergrowth, and occasional drops of blood that glisten darkly in your flashlight beam. After about half a mile, you hear something that makes your blood freeze. A human voice, weak but unmistakably alive, calling for help somewhere ahead of you. You quicken your pace, pushing through a thick stand of pine saplings, and emerge into a small clearing. What you see there will haunt your dreams for the rest of your life. Knox Davidson, a man in his 30s, is tied to a massive oak tree with what looks like strips of bark. His face is bloody, one eye swollen shut, but he's conscious and alert. 20 feet away, his wife Preston and their twin daughters, who can't be more than 8 years old, are bound to another tree. They're alive, but they're bait. You realize this just as something massive crashes through the undergrowth behind you. You spin around, drawing your weapon, and come face to face with the thing that's been terrorizing Howling Pines for decades. The dogman stands nearly 8 feet tall, its muscular frame covered in coarse dark fur that seems to absorb your flashlight beam. Its head is distinctly canine, elongated snout filled with teeth like railroad spikes, ears that twitch at every sound. But its eyes are disturbingly human, showing an intelligence that no animal should possess. It moves on its hind legs with surprising grace for something so large, powerful arms ending in clawed hands that could tear a man in half. When it sees you, it tilts its head slightly, studying you with those horrible, knowing eyes. Let them go, you say, raising your weapon. Your voice sounds steadier than you feel. This is between you and me now. The creature's lips pull back in what might be a grin, revealing rows of fangs designed for rending flesh from bone. It makes a sound, not quite a howl, not quite a laugh, but something that combines the worst aspects of both. Then it moves. You've never seen anything so large move so fast. 1 second it's 20 feet away, the next it's on you, claws raking across your chest and sending you flying backward into a tree. Your weapon goes spinning into the darkness as you hit the oak hard enough to knock the wind from your lungs. The dogman doesn't follow up immediately. Instead, it retrieves your pistol with surprising delicacy, examining the weapon with something approaching curiosity before crushing it in one massive hand. The metal screams as it deforms, pieces dropping to the forest floor like broken toys. "It's playing with us," Knox gasps from his position tied to the tree. "It could have killed us already, but it's enjoying this." You struggle to your feet, tasting blood. The claw marks across your chest are painful but not deep. The creature held back, you realize. It wants you alive, at least for now. The dogman circles the clearing, never taking its eyes off you. Each footstep shakes the ground slightly, and you can hear its breathing. Deep, controlled, patient. It's savoring this moment, the terror in its prey's eyes. That's when you remember the flares in your gear belt. Your hand moves slowly toward the emergency kit, hoping the creature won't notice the movement. But those intelligent eyes miss nothing. The dogman's head tilts again, and you see something like amusement in its expression. It wants to see what you'll do. You grab the flare and strike it against the ignition strip. Brilliant red light floods the clearing, and for just a moment, the dogman recoils, raising one clawed hand to shield its sensitive eyes. That moment of distraction is all you need. You hurl the burning flare directly at the creature's face, then immediately light a second one. The dogman roars, a sound that seems to shake the very trees, and stumbles backward, pawing at its eyes. "Knox!" you shout, running toward the bound family with your survival knife drawn. "Get ready to move!" You slice through Knox's bonds first, then help him free his family while the dogman thrashes in the red-lit clearing, temporarily blinded but already recovering. Knox scoops up one daughter while Preston grabs the other, and you all run for the tree line, but you know running won't be enough. The dogman knows these woods better than you ever will, and once its vision clears, it will hunt you down with methodical efficiency. You need a plan, and you need it fast. As your small group crashes through the underbrush, you think about everything you know about the creature. It's incredibly strong and fast, but the flare affected it. Maybe it has other weaknesses you can exploit. Maybe there's still a way to survive this nightmare. Behind you, the roaring stops, and you know the hunt is about to begin in earnest. Your group stumbles through the dark forest, trying to put distance between yourselves and the creature, while making as little noise as possible. Knox carries 8-year-old Lennon while Preston struggles with her twin sister Archer. Both girls are in shock, too terrified to cry, which might be the only thing keeping you alive right now. You lead them toward what you hope is safety, an old fire lookout tower about 2 miles north of the clearing. Built in the 1960s and abandoned years ago, it's one of the few structures in this part of the forest that might offer some protection. If you can reach it, you might be able to radio for help or at least have the high ground advantage. The forest is eerily quiet around you. No night sounds, no insects. Nothing but the soft whisper of your footsteps on the pine needle carpet. Even the wind has died down as if nature itself is holding its breath. "Is it following us?" Preston whispers, shifting Archer's weight in her arms. You pause, listening carefully. No sounds of pursuit, no breaking branches or heavy footfalls. But that doesn't mean anything. The dogman could be stalking you silently, staying just beyond your hearing while it chooses the perfect moment to strike. "Keep moving," you say quietly. "We're almost there." The fire tower looms out of the darkness like a skeletal finger pointing at the stars. 50 feet of steel framework topped by a small observation cabin. It's seen better days but looks structurally sound. More importantly, there's only one way up, a narrow ladder that would force any pursuer to climb in the open. You test the ladder's stability, then gesture for Knox to start climbing with Lennon. "Go quickly, but don't make noise," you whisper. "I'll come up last." As the family makes their way up the tower, you keep watch on the surrounding forest. Your flashlight is dimmed to preserve battery life, creating just enough illumination to see immediate threats. The red flare burned out long ago, leaving you in the blue-black darkness of a moonless night. That's when you see them, 2 golden points of light moving through the trees about 100 yards away. The dogman's eyes, reflecting what little starlight filters through the canopy. It's found your trail and is closing in, but slowly, deliberately. like it knows exactly where you're going. You scramble up the ladder, taking the rungs two at a time. Behind you, you can hear heavy footsteps now, no longer bothering with stealth. The creature knows you're trapped. The observation cabin is cramped but solid, with thick wooden walls and windows on all sides. Knox has barricaded the door with an old desk while Preston comforts the girls in one corner. You immediately go for the radio equipment, hoping against hope that some of it still works. Most of the gear is ancient and corroded, but you manage to coax life from an old emergency radio. Static fills the air, then clears to reveal Omar's voice coming through weakly. Base to Ranger 7, do you copy? You grab the microphone. Omar, this is an emergency. I'm at the old fire tower with 4 civilians. We're under attack by something in the woods. I need immediate backup, every unit you can spare. Roger that. State police are already en route to Devil's Backbone. What's your exact situation? Before you can answer, the tower shakes. Not violently, but enough to rattle the windows and make everyone in the cabin go quiet. Something very large and very strong has just struck the base of the tower. You move to the window and look down. In the darkness below, you can barely make out a massive shape circling the tower's base. As you watch, it rears up on its hind legs and places its front paws against the steel framework. The entire structure groans under the pressure. It's trying to bring down the tower, you say into the radio. I don't think this thing will hold much longer. Another impact, stronger this time. Books fall from shelves, and one of the windows develops a spiderweb of cracks. The dogman is systematically attacking the tower's support struts, and from the sound of screaming metal, it's succeeding. Knox joins you at the window, his face pale in the flashlight's glow. What does it want with us? Why doesn't it just leave? That's when you notice something that changes everything. In your flashlight beam, you can see deep gouges in the cabin's wooden walls, claw marks that match the ones you've been finding at attack sites. Old marks weathered by years of exposure. This isn't random, you realize running your fingers along the scratches. This tower, it's been here before, maybe many times. You search the cabin more thoroughly, pushing aside decades of accumulated debris. In a corner beneath some moldy canvas, you find a metal strongbox that's been hidden away. The lock is corroded but still functional, and you manage to force it open with your survival knife. Inside are dozens of photographs, newspaper clippings, and handwritten reports dating back to the 1960s, all documenting encounters with the same creature that's currently trying to kill you. One photograph stops you cold. It shows a group of hunters from 1967, posing with their rifles next to what's obviously the dogman's body. The creature is lying on its side, clearly dead, with multiple bullet wounds visible in its torso. But if they killed it in 1967, what's stalking you now? You flip through more photos, finding similar shots from different decades. The dogman's body with different groups of hunters, different wounds, different backgrounds. 1973, 1981, 1994, 2003. My God, you whisper, understanding flooding through you like ice water. They keep killing it, but it keeps coming back. The tower shakes again, more violently this time. Through the fractured window, you can hear the creature below making sounds you've never heard before. Not growls or roars, but something almost like speech. Guttural, inhuman, but with a rhythm and cadence that suggests language. Preston has noticed the photographs and is looking through them with growing horror. Look at this, she says, holding up a yellowed newspaper clipping. From the Traverse City Record Eagle, 1952, local woodsman claims to have killed Devil Dog, and this one from 1963, Monster of Howling Pines finally destroyed. The pattern is clear. Every few years, someone claims to have killed the Dogman. There are always photographs, always witnesses, always relief in the community. But the disappearances never stop for long. After a few months or a year of peace, people start vanishing again. A new photograph catches your attention. This one much more recent, probably from the 1990s based on the clothing styles. It shows a young park ranger, probably not much older than you, standing over the Dogman's corpse. The ranger's name tag is just visible, C. Morrison. Morrison. That name is familiar, but you can't place it immediately. Then you remember Cash Morrison, the fisherman who disappeared in July. His wife Emily had mentioned that his father was a park ranger here in the 1990s. The families, you say, pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. It's targeting families of people who killed it before. Knox looks up from the photographs. What do you mean? Every person who's disappeared this summer, I bet if we checked, we'd find their fathers or grandfathers are in these photos. The dog man isn't just hunting randomly, it's getting revenge. The tower lurches suddenly, tilting at least 10 degrees before settling back. Metal screams in protest, and you realize you're out of time. The structure won't survive another assault like that. But now you understand what you're dealing with. This isn't just some mindless beast, it's something that remembers, something that holds grudges across generations, something that refuses to stay dead. And if the pattern holds, killing it again won't solve anything. It will just ensure that your own children years from now become its targets. The radio crackles back to life. Ranger 7, State Police are 20 minutes out. Can you hold your position? You look around the tilting cabin at the terrified family huddled in the corner, at the photographs scattered across the floor. 20 minutes might as well be 20 hours. Negative, you say into the microphone. We're abandoning this position. If anyone gets through on this frequency, tell them to look for survivors at... You pause, thinking quickly. Where can you go that might offer better protection? Then you remember something from the old files back at the station. There was one place in all of Howling Pines where no disappearances had ever occurred. One area the dogman seemed to avoid completely. The old Native American burial ground, 3 miles east of the tower. Tell them to search near the burial ground on Pine Ridge, you say, and tell them to bring everything they've got. This thing isn't going to stop. You turn to Knox and Preston. We're leaving, right now. Stay close together and don't look back no matter what you hear. Outside, the dogman has gone silent, but you know it's still there, waiting. As you prepare to lead this family into the darkness, you can only hope that the old legends about sacred ground hold some truth. Because if they don't, you're all going to die tonight. The descent from the tower is the longest 30 seconds of your life. You go first, testing each rung to make sure the creature's assault hasn't weakened the ladder's connection to the framework. Knox follows with Lennon, then Preston carrying Archer, moving as quickly as they dare in the darkness. You're halfway down when the tower shudders again. The dogman hasn't given up its assault. It's just been waiting for you to come back within reach. You shine your flashlight toward the base of the structure and catch a glimpse of massive claws wrapped around one of the support beams. Move faster, you whisper urgently. It knows we're coming down. Your feet hit solid ground just as another impact rocks the tower. This time, you hear the distinctive sound of metal beginning to fail. A high-pitched groan followed by sharp pops as rivets give way. The entire structure is starting to lean at a dangerous angle. Knox drops to the ground behind you, immediately reaching up to help Preston with Archer. The 8-year-old is barely conscious, exhaustion and shock taking their toll. Her sister Lennon is in better shape but clearly terrified, clinging to her father's neck as he lifts her down. You don't wait for the family to get organized. The moment Preston's feet touch earth, you're already moving toward the tree line, away from the tower and the creature that's been using it as a toy. The forest seems even darker now, if that's possible. Your flashlight beam barely penetrates 10 feet into the undergrowth, creating more shadows than it eliminates. But you know these woods better than most, and the burial ground on Pine Ridge is burned into your memory from countless search and rescue operations over the years. 3 miles northeast, following the old deer trail that winds along Whisper Creek, before climbing into the hills. If the legends are true, if sacred ground really can offer protection from things like the dogman, then it's your only hope. Behind you, the tower finally succumbs to the creature's assault. The crash echoes through the forest like thunder, followed by a roar of triumph that makes your skin crawl. The dogman has destroyed your refuge and knows you're on the run. Why aren't we heading toward the road? Preston gasps, struggling to keep up while carrying Archer. Shouldn't we be trying to reach the police? It would catch us long before we reached help, you explain, pushing through a thick stand of saplings. Our only chance is to reach someplace it won't or can't follow. Knox shifts Lennon's weight in his arms. The burial ground you mentioned, you really think that'll work? Honestly, you have no idea. The stories about the Pine Ridge burial ground being protected are mostly local folklore, passed down through generations of Native Americans and early settlers. The Ojibwe tribe that once lived in this area considered it sacred, a place where the spirits of their ancestors watched over the land. But folklore is all you have left. Everything else, weapons, backup, rational explanations, has failed against the dogman. Sometimes the old stories are the only truth that matters. You follow Whisper Creek for nearly a mile, using the sound of running water to guide you through the darkness. The family struggles to keep pace, especially Preston with Archer growing heavier in her arms, but you can't afford to slow down. Every minute you spend on the trail gives the dogman more time to close the distance. The creature is following. You can feel its presence like a weight pressing against your back. Occasionally you catch glimpses of those golden eyes reflecting your flashlight beam, staying just at the edge of visibility. It's not rushing to attack, though. It's herding you, driving you towards some predetermined killing ground. Or maybe it knows where you're headed and finds the idea amusing. Maybe sacred ground means nothing to something that's died and returned multiple times over the decades. The trail begins to climb as you leave the creek behind, winding up into the hills where the oldest trees and howling pines grow in silent majesty. These are the giants that were here when the first Europeans arrived. Massive white pines that have weathered centuries of storms and seasons. And somewhere among them, on a hill that rises above the forest like a green island, lies the burial ground that might be your salvation. Knox is starting to struggle with Lennon's weight, and you can hear Preston breathing heavily behind you. The girls are beyond exhaustion, barely conscious as their parents carry them through the nightmare landscape. How much further? Knox asks, sweat streaming down his face despite the cool night air. Maybe half a mile, you say, checking your compass by flashlight. The trail gets steeper from here, but we're almost there. That's when you hear it. The sound you've been dreading. Heavy footsteps crashing through the underbrush, no longer bothering with stealth. The dogman has decided to end this game. Run, you say, breaking into a sprint. Don't look back, just run. The family follows as best they can, Knox and Preston stumbling over roots and rocks in the darkness while you light the way ahead. Behind you, the sounds of pursuit grow closer. Branches snapping, leaves rustling, and underneath it all, that horrible panting breath. The trail reaches its steepest section, climbing sharply toward the ridgeline. Your legs burn with the effort, and you can only imagine how the others are suffering. But the alternative is worse than exhaustion. Then, through the trees ahead, you see it. A break in the canopy, where starlight filters down to illuminate a small clearing on the hilltop. The burial ground on Pine Ridge, marked by a ring of standing stones that have weathered centuries of wind and rain. There, you shout, pointing toward the clearing. That's it! You reach the edge of the sacred space just as the dogman crashes out of the forest behind you, moving with terrifying speed despite its size. It covers the distance between the trees and the stone circle in 3 massive strides, claws extended to tear you apart. But something stops it. The creature skids to a halt just inches from the nearest standing stone, as if it's run into an invisible wall. It snarls and tests the boundary, reaching one clawed hand toward the circle but pulls back as if burned. You don't waste time questioning why it worked. You grab Knox and Preston, pulling them and the girls into the center of the stone circle. The moment you cross the boundary, you feel it, a sense of peace and safety that seems impossible given your circumstances. The dogman circles the burial ground like a caged animal, testing the perimeter but unable to cross. Its golden eyes burn with frustrated rage as it realizes its prey has found sanctuary. My God, Preston whispers, setting Archer down on the soft grass within the circle. It actually worked. Knox collapses beside his daughters, exhaustion finally overwhelming him. How is this possible? What is this place? You sink down onto one of the fallen stones, your body shaking from adrenaline and relief. The Ojibwe believed this was a place where the spirit world touched the physical world. They said their ancestors' spirits protected anyone who sought refuge here. The dogman has stopped pacing and is now sitting on its haunches just outside the stone circle, watching you with those disturbingly intelligent eyes. It's not going anywhere. It's willing to wait you out, knowing you can't stay here forever. So what now? Knox asks. We just wait for the police to find us? That's when you notice something else about the creature's behavior. It's not just watching you. It's looking at something specific. Following its gaze, you see that it's focused on one particular stone in the circle, a tall granite monolith covered in carved symbols. Getting closer to examine the stone, you realize the symbols aren't Ojibwe at all. They're much older, carved by people who lived in this area long before any known Native American tribes. And at the base of the stone, partially hidden by moss and age, is something that makes your blood run cold. More photographs, like the ones you found in the fire tower. But these are much older, dating back to the early 1900s. They show the same scene, groups of men standing over the dogman's corpse, but the backgrounds are different. These kills didn't happen in Howling Pines. They happened all across the Great Lakes region in different forests, different states, going back more than a century. And in every photograph, the creature looks exactly the same. Not aged, not changed, just constant. One photograph stops you cold. It's from 1923, showing a young man in ranger gear standing over the dogman's body somewhere in the forests of northern Wisconsin. The man's face is strangely familiar, and when you read the inscription on the back, you understand why. William Morrison, first documented kill, Chequamegon National Forest. Morrison, Cash Morrison's grandfather. The bloodline goes back 3 generations, and the dogman has been hunting them for over a century. You look up at the creature watching you from beyond the stone circle. Those golden eyes hold more than animal intelligence. They hold the accumulated rage of something that has been killed dozens of times but refuses to stay dead. Something that remembers every face, every family, every injustice. And as dawn approaches on the horizon, you realize that, sacred ground or not, this confrontation is far from over. The dogman isn't just a monster, it's a force of nature seeking balance, and it won't rest until the scales are even. The question is, what will it take to finally put this thing to rest? Dawn comes slowly to Pine Ridge, painting the eastern sky in shades of orange and gold. You've been awake all night, watching the dogman maintain its vigil outside the stone circle. It hasn't moved from its position, hasn't shown any signs of fatigue or impatience. It simply waits, like death itself. Knox and Preston have managed to get a few hours of sleep, exhaustion overcoming fear. The twins, Lennon and Archer, are curled up together on a bed of pine needles, still unconscious from the trauma of the night. You envy them their escape from this waking nightmare. Your radio has been silent since the tower fell, the old emergency unit probably damaged beyond repair. But in the growing daylight, you can see a faint trail of smoke rising from the valley below, probably the state police, searching the remains of the fire tower. Help is out there, but it might as well be on the moon. The dogman seems to sense your thoughts. It turns its massive head toward the smoke, then looks back at you with what might be amusement. It knows the authorities are coming, and it doesn't care. Whatever protection the burial ground offers, it won't last forever. There has to be a way to end this, you say, speaking as much to yourself as to the creature. You can't just keep killing people forever. To your surprise, the dogman reacts to your voice. Its ears perk up, and it tilts its head in that disturbingly human gesture. For a moment you think you see something other than rage in those golden eyes, something like sadness. That's when you notice the newest photographs scattered around the base of the stone monolith. These aren't old, weathered images from decades past. These are recent, probably taken within the last few weeks. They show the dogman's latest victims. Not dead, but alive and apparently unharmed, standing in what looks like a cave or underground chamber. Carter Williams, the first to disappear. Cash Morrison, the fisherman. Remy Patterson, the grad student. All the people you assumed were dead, all apparently being kept somewhere. But why? You study the photographs more carefully, looking for clues about their location. The walls of the chamber are natural stone, probably limestone based on the formations visible in the background. There are symbols carved into the walls, the same ancient markings you've seen on the standing stones. Knox, you say quietly, not wanting to wake the girls. Take a look at these. Knox examines the photographs with growing excitement. They're alive? All of them? Looks that way. But I don't understand why the dogman would keep prisoners. Every account I've read describes it as a killer, not a kidnapper. The creature outside the circle makes a sound, not a growl or a roar, but something almost like a whine. A sound of frustration or loss? Looking at it more carefully in the daylight, you notice things you missed in the darkness. The dogman's fur is grizzled with patches of gray, its movements slightly stiff as if from old injuries. This isn't a young, aggressive predator. This is something ancient, tired, carrying the weight of decades. More pieces of the puzzle click into place. The photographs showing it being killed over and over again. The targeting of specific family lines. The careful preservation of victims rather than simple slaughter. It's not revenge, you realize suddenly. It's recruitment. Knox looks at you like you've lost your mind. What are you talking about? Think about it. Every person who's disappeared has a connection to someone who killed the dogman in the past. It's not taking them to hurt them, it's taking them to replace them. To build some kind of family. The dogman's reaction confirms your theory. It nods slowly, an unmistakably human gesture. And for the first time since this nightmare began, you don't see rage in its eyes. You see loneliness. Preston has woken up and is listening to your conversation with growing horror. Replace them? Replace them with what? You don't answer immediately because you're not sure you want to voice what you're thinking. But the evidence is right there in front of you. The creature's intelligence, its ability to plan and remember, its seemingly supernatural resilience. I think, you say carefully, that the dogman isn't just one creature. I think it's a condition, something that can be passed on. The implications are staggering. If you're right, then everyone who's ever claimed to kill the dogman didn't actually kill it. They just forced it to find a new host. And now it's trying to build a pack, recruiting descendants of its former killers to join it in whatever cursed existence it inhabits. Your radio suddenly crackles to life, startling everyone in the circle. Omar's voice comes through clearly, stronger than it was last night. Ranger 7, this is base. State police have reached the tower site. What's your current position? You grab the radio, hope flaring in your chest. Base, we're at the Pine Ridge burial ground. 4 civilians with me, all alive. But we have a situation here that requires immediate assistance. Roger that. Helicopters en route to your location for extraction. ETA 15 minutes. 15 minutes. You look at the dogman, still watching patiently from beyond the stone circle. Will the helicopter's arrival force it to retreat? Or will it see the aircraft as just another threat to eliminate? As if reading your thoughts, the creature stands and walks closer to the circle's edge. When it speaks, its voice is like gravel mixed with wind, barely human but unmistakably intelligent. No. More. Running. The words hit you like physical blows. The dogman can speak. Has always been able to speak. Everything you thought you knew about this creature crumbles in an instant. What do you want? You ask, trying to keep your voice steady. Family, it says, the word dripping with loneliness that spans decades. Tired of being alone. Knox pulls his daughters closer, his face pale with understanding. You want to take our children? The dogman shakes its massive head. Want to give them purpose, power, forever. Now you understand the true horror of what you're facing. The Dogman isn't just a monster, it's a corrupted form of immortality, a curse that grants eternal life at the cost of everything human. And it's been trying to share that curse with the descendants of those who've heard it. The people you took, you say, they're still human? Changing, the creature replies. Becoming. Like me. Like you. Could be. The offer hangs in the air like poison. Eternal life, incredible power, but at what cost? You think about the photographs in the cave, about Cash Morrison and the others. Are they still themselves, or have they become something else entirely? The sound of helicopter rotors grows audible in the distance. The Dogman hears it too, its ears swiveling toward the approaching aircraft. For the first time since dawn, it looks agitated. Choose, it says, fixing you with those golden eyes. Come, willingly, or I take them. Anyway. The sacred ground won't protect you forever, and you know it. The burial ground might keep the Dogman at bay temporarily, but it can't hold off a creature with unlimited time and patience. Eventually you'll have to leave this circle, and when you do, it will be waiting. But there might be another way. The photographs from the cave show symbols carved into the walls, the same markings that appear on the standing stones. If the burial ground has power over the creature, maybe those symbols are the key to understanding how to use that power. You make your decision. I'll come with you, you say, stepping toward the edge of the circle. But you let the family go, and you take me to where you're keeping the others. No! Knox jumps to his feet, grabbing your arm. You can't trust that thing. The Dogman watches your approach with something like respect. When you reach the boundary of the sacred ground, it extends one massive clawed hand. Your word, you say, not moving any closer. Promise me they'll be safe. Safe. The creature agrees. Always. Safe. You have my word. You look back at Knox, Preston, and the girls one last time, then step across the stone circle's boundary. The moment your foot touches the ground outside the protected area, you feel it. A presence pressing against your mind, ancient and tired and desperately lonely. The Dogman's hand closes around yours with surprising gentleness. Its claws could tear you apart, but they barely leave marks on your skin. This close, you can see the intelligence in its eyes more clearly, along with something else. Hope. The others, you say as the helicopter grows louder overhead. Show me. The creature nods and begins walking toward the forest, pulling you along. Behind you, you can hear Knox shouting your name, but you don't look back. This is the only way to save them, and maybe, just maybe, the only way to finally put an end to the Dogman's century-long hunt. As you disappear into the trees, the last thing you hear is the helicopter landing in the burial ground, come to rescue a family that no longer needs rescuing. But your own fate remains very much in question. The cave system beneath Howling Pines is vast and ancient, carved by underground rivers that dried up millennia ago. The Dogman leads you through passages that seem to go on forever, lit by phosphorescent fungi that cast everything in an eerie green glow. Finally, you emerge into a large chamber where your worst fears and greatest hopes are confirmed. Cash Morrison is there, along with Carter Williams, Remy Patterson, and 24 others you don't recognize. They're alive, but changed. Taller, stronger, with eyes that reflect light like animals. Still human, but becoming something else. You came, Cash says, his voice deeper than you remember. I was hoping someone would figure it out eventually. Figure what out, you ask, though you think you already know. The Dogman isn't the curse, Cash explains, gesturing to the symbols carved into the chamber walls. The Dogman is what happens when the curse has no one left to share itself with. We're the cure. He shows you the truth in the ancient markings. The curse was created centuries ago by Native American shamans as a last resort against settlers who were destroying their land. But it was never meant to create a solitary monster. It was supposed to create a pack of guardians, protectors who would ensure the forest's survival. Instead, generation after generation of humans killed the transformed guardians, forcing the curse to jump from host to host, growing more lonely and desperate with each passing decade. So what happens now, you ask? Cash smiles, and for a moment he looks completely human again. Now we have enough people to break the cycle. The dogman doesn't have to be alone anymore, and the forest gets the protectors it was always meant to have. The transformation, when it comes, is surprisingly painless. You feel your senses expanding, your strength increasing, your connection to the forest deepening until every tree, every stream, every living thing becomes part of your awareness. When it's over, you understand why the dogman spent so many decades gathering his pack. The loneliness of carrying such a burden alone would drive anyone to desperate measures. But now there are enough of you to share the responsibility, to protect howling pines without the need for violence or fear. The disappearances will stop. The killings will end. And somewhere in the world above, families like Knox's will continue to camp and hike and fish, never knowing they're being watched over by guardians who were once human themselves. It's not the ending you expected when this nightmare began. But as you feel the last of your humanity merge with something larger and more ancient, you realize it might be the ending the forest always deserved. The dogman, your predecessor, your teacher, your pack leader, finally allows himself to rest, knowing his vigil can continue in other hands, in other paws. The hunt is over. The protection has just begun. My name is Silas McCleary, and this happened to me in 2013 in New River Gorge National Park and Preserve. I took the transfer for quiet nights and empty sandstone walls, thinking I'd escape the chaos of my previous posting at Yellowstone, where crowds of tourists turned every shift into crowd control. How wrong I was. Some places have a way of calling to the darkness, and the gorge, with its endless caverns carved by centuries of rushing water, was one of them. The job sounded simple enough when Gary briefed me that first morning. Patrol the endless walls, check climbing anchors, keep the campgrounds clean. The pay was decent, the scenery spectacular, and best of all, the visitor numbers were manageable. What Gary didn't mention in that sterile government briefing room was the way sound carried in the gorge, how a whisper at the base of the cliffs could echo for what felt like miles through the limestone passages beneath. How the mist that rose from the river each dawn seemed to carry more than just moisture. It brought whispers of things long buried in the dark. June storms had swollen the New River into something monstrous, the kind of churning brown water that swallows whole trees and spits them out miles downstream as splinters. The water moved with a violence that seemed almost alive, angry at being confined between the ancient walls that had taken millions of years to carve. When I stood on the rim that first week, watching the torrent below, I felt something watching me back. It was a ridiculous thought, the kind of paranoid notion that comes from spending too much time alone in wild places, but I couldn't shake it. 2 climbers vanished on a dawn approach, and the district office wanted a boots-on-ground search while the county handled publicity. I was the boots. Frank, my supervisor, called it a routine recovery operation, but there was something in his voice that suggested otherwise. The way he avoided eye contact when he handed me the search parameters. The way he lingered at the door of his office, as if he wanted to say something more but thought better of it. "Just stick to the established trails, McCleary," he'd said finally. "Don't go wandering off into areas that aren't on the maps." It was an odd warning. Rangers are trained to go where others can't or won't. But Frank had been working the gorge for 15 years, and there was something in his weathered face that spoke of hard-earned wisdom. Still, I was new, eager to prove myself, and confident in my abilities. I should have listened. The first sign sat at the base of Fern Point, a neat pile of river stones, each stone streaked with dried blood that had turned rust brown in the humid air. Someone, or something, had arranged them shoulder-high against the cliff face, dead center on the approach trail where no climber could miss them. The arrangement was too deliberate to be natural. too precise to be the work of animals. Each stone had been carefully selected for size and color, stacked with an almost ritualistic precision that made my skin crawl. I circled the cairn slowly, looking for boot prints, claw marks, any sign of who or what might have built it. The ground around the base was smooth river sand, undisturbed except for my own footprints. No boot treads, no paw prints, nothing to suggest how the stones had gotten there. The silence was complete. No bird songs, no rustle of leaves in the wind that I could feel brushing against my face. Even the ever-present buzz of insects had died away, as if the very presence of the cairn had created a dead zone in the natural world. There was a cold iron smell that rode the mist rising from the river, sharp and metallic like old pennies left in the rain. It caught in the back of my throat and made me want to spit, but when I did, the taste lingered. I bagged a sample of the blood-streaked stone and radioed it in, describing the location and appearance with the clinical detachment they'd trained into me at the academy. "Dispatch to Ranger McCleary," came the crackling reply. "Probably just black bears making art projects. They're curious creatures." Joseph, the dispatcher, was chuckling as he said it, and I could picture him in the climate-controlled comfort of the visitor center, feet up on his desk, thinking about lunch. To him, this was just another oddity to file away and forget. But he hadn't seen the cairn, hadn't felt the wrongness that radiated from it like heat from blacktop. He hadn't breathed in that metallic stench that seemed to coat the inside of my lungs. I didn't laugh. Couldn't laugh. There was something about the arrangement that spoke to an intelligence far beyond what any bear possessed, something that understood symbolism and territory marking in ways that made my ranger training feel woefully inadequate. As I walked away from Fern Point, I could feel the cairn behind me like a weight between my shoulder blades. Every few steps, I found myself turning to look back, half expecting to find it had moved or multiplied. That evening, I sat in my government-issue trailer reviewing the day's notes and trying to rationalize what I'd seen. The stones were just stones. The blood was probably from some animal that had cut itself on the sharp edges. The precise arrangement was just a coincidence, or perhaps the work of some hiker with too much time and a twisted sense of humor. But even as I wrote these explanations in my official log, I didn't believe them. The trailer's thin walls did nothing to muffle the sounds of the gorge at night. Water rushing over rocks, wind moaning through the canyon, the occasional crash of a tree falling somewhere in the darkness. But beneath these familiar sounds, I began to notice something else, a rhythmic tapping that seemed to come from deep underground. 3 quick taps, then silence. 3 more taps from a different direction, like Morse code, but in a language I couldn't understand. I told myself it was just the settling of rocks, thermal expansion and contraction causing the ancient stone to shift and crack. But the timing was too regular, too purposeful, and always those same 3 taps, never more, never less. As if something in the depths was trying to communicate. Sleep came fitfully that first night, filled with dreams of dark water and clicking sounds that followed me through endless underground passages. In the morning, I woke to find my windows covered in a thin film of moisture that looked almost oily in the early light. When I tried to wipe it away, my hand came back stained with something that looked disturbingly like the dried blood from the cairn stones. I spent an extra long time in the shower that morning, scrubbing my hands until they were raw, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had marked me during the night, something that now knew my scent, my location, my vulnerabilities. The gorge had accepted me, but not as a protector, as prey. At dusk, I walked the ridgeline with Jess Vargas, a rookie ranger on her 3rd week. She was eager and competent, the kind of ranger who'd studied every manual cover to cover and could recite wildlife behavior statistics from memory. 23 years old, fresh out of the academy, with the kind of confidence that comes from book learning rather than experience. I envied that confidence even as I worried about it. Black bears are generally non-aggressive unless protecting cubs or food sources, she rattled off, as we picked our way along the narrow trail that hugged the cliff edge. They're omnivorous, but prefer vegetation and insects. Human encounters are typically the result of improper food storage or... Her voice was steady, professional, the words flowing easily as she tried to convince herself as much as me that there was a rational explanation for everything we might encounter. But I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes kept darting to the dark spaces between the trees below us. The gorge had a way of getting under your skin, even if you were too inexperienced to understand why. We both stopped when the gorge went silent. It wasn't the natural quiet that sometimes settles over wilderness areas. This was something deeper, more complete. The cicadas that had been droning endlessly since late afternoon cut off mid-buzz. The owls that should have been starting their evening hunt choked back their hoots. Even the constant whisper of wind through the canyon went still, as if the very air had stopped moving. The silence stretched for 30 seconds, maybe a full minute. Long enough for us to exchange worried glances, long enough for Jess to reach unconsciously for the radio on her belt. Then, from somewhere down in the trees, came a hollow clicking sound. 3 quick taps, just like I'd heard the night before, like somebody knocking rock on rock, but with a hollow metallic quality that made my teeth ache. "Woodpecker," Jess whispered, but there was no conviction in her voice. "Woodpeckers don't hunt at night," I replied, though I kept my own voice just as low. Something about the silence demanded whispers. The clicking came again, this time from a different location, maybe 50 yards to the north. Then again from the south, as if whatever was making the sound was circling us in the darkness below. The pattern was always the same. 3 sharp taps, then silence. But the spacing between the sequences was irregular, sometimes 5 seconds, sometimes 20, as if the thing making the sound was listening for responses. We kept moving, but I could feel Jess tensing beside me with every sound. Her textbook knowledge of wildlife behavior didn't include this kind of territorial marking, this deliberate stalking pattern that spoke to an intelligence far beyond what any known animal possessed. When we reached the end of the ridge trail, she was practically vibrating with nervous energy. "Should we investigate?" she asked, though I could tell from her tone that she hoped I'd say no. "Not in the dark," I replied. "We'll come back in the morning with backup." But morning brought something far worse than mysterious sounds in the darkness. We found the first body next morning, half submerged in Devil's Creek, a side stream that fed into the new river about 2 miles upstream from the main camping area. The water here was usually crystal clear, fed by underground springs that bubbled up through limestone beds. Now it ran rust red, and the metallic smell I'd noticed at the cairn hung heavy in the humid air. The victim's climbing harness and rope remained intact, still secured to the rock face above the creek. The gear was expensive, professional-grade equipment that showed signs of regular use and careful maintenance. But everything from the collarbones up was gone, sheared away so cleanly that for a moment my brain refused to process what I was seeing. There was no ragged tearing, no scavenger marks, no indication that animals had been feeding. Just a clean, wet cut as if some massive blade, a shovel scoop wide, had taken the head and shoulders in one precise pass. I pulled her ID from the dry bag still clipped to her harness. Emily Nagel, 26, biology graduate student from the University of West Virginia. According to her permits, she'd been studying amphibian populations in the area for her thesis research. The irony wasn't lost on me. She'd come here to study the creatures that lived between land and water, and something that belonged to neither world had killed her. My stomach twisted as I photographed the scene, trying to maintain professional objectivity while fighting down the urge to vomit. In 23 years of law enforcement and park service work, I'd seen plenty of death. Car accidents, heart attacks, the occasional climbing fall or drowning. But this was different. This was deliberate, surgical in its precision, and the way the wound had been sealed, with no blood trail leading away from the body, suggested that whatever had done this had consumed what it had taken. The state police took custody of the remains, but Captain Douglas pulled me aside before they loaded the body bag into the ambulance. He was a 20-year veteran with kind eyes and premature gray hair, the kind of cop who'd seen everything and rarely let it show on his face. but standing there beside Devil's Creek, watching the red-stained water gurgle past our feet, he looked genuinely disturbed. "Off the record, McCleary," he said quietly. "That cut looks mechanical, like something with an edge. Equipment, maybe. Propeller blade." I nodded, though we both knew there was no equipment in these woods that could have made such a cut. No boats on the shallow creek, no machinery of any kind for miles. "What's your official theory?" "Officially? Animal attack. Bear, probably. Scavengers cleaned up afterward." He paused, studying my face. "But rivers don't hide propeller blades at their sources, and bears don't make cuts that clean." The captain was right about one thing. Emily had died upstream of any current strong enough to turn mechanical equipment. The creek at this point was barely knee-deep, fed by springs that bubbled up through beds of moss-covered limestone. The water moved lazily toward the main river, carrying nothing more dangerous than fallen leaves and the occasional crayfish. I hiked back toward the main trail, feeling deeply uneasy, checking my radio every few minutes and keeping one hand near the service pistol that suddenly felt inadequate for whatever we were dealing with. The forest around Devil's Creek felt different now, charged with a malevolent energy that made every shadow seem to move with purpose. Birds called in the distance, but their songs sounded strained, almost panicked. That night, Jess and I camped on the ridge, unwilling to retreat to the safety of our respective trailers. Something about Emily's death had convinced us both that isolation was the enemy now, that whatever was hunting in these woods preferred solitary targets. We pitched our tents back to back and built a fire larger than regulations technically allowed, feeding it constantly to keep the circle of light as wide as possible. Around 11 p.m. the clicking returned. Closer now, maybe 30 yards from our campsite, circling in the darkness beyond the firelight like a predator testing our defenses. The sound was clearer now, and I realized it wasn't rock on rock after all. It was more organic, like bones snapping together inside something's throat. The rhythm was hypnotic, almost musical, but wrong in a way that made my skin crawl. Jess shined her powerful LED flashlight in the direction of the sounds, sweeping the beam back and forth across the trees. The light caught nothing but moving fog and the gleaming eyes of small creatures. Raccoons probably, or opossums, fleeing whatever was making the clicking sounds. But there were too many eyes, reflecting the light from too many directions, as if every creature in the forest was running from the same thing we couldn't see. We sat back to back until dawn, taking turns keeping watch while the other dozed fitfully. The clicking continued intermittently through the night, always moving, always staying just outside our circle of light. Sometimes it seemed to come from the trees above us, as if something was moving through the canopy with impossible grace. Other times it echoed up from the ground itself, as if the thing was traveling through underground passages we couldn't see. When the sun finally rose, painting the canyon walls in shades of gold and red, the forest sounds gradually returned to normal. But I knew we'd crossed a line during the night. Whatever was out there had been studying us, learning our habits and vulnerabilities, and now it knew we were afraid. Day 3 brought a horror that would haunt me for the rest of my life. Jess didn't show at shift start, which wasn't like her. She was the kind of ranger who showed up 15 minutes early and had her equipment ready before the briefing began. When she didn't answer her radio, I hiked to her campsite expecting to find her sick or dealing with equipment problems. What I found was worse than anything I could have imagined. Her tent lay collapsed, the orange fabric twisted and torn as if something massive had fallen on it from above. The lightweight aluminum poles were snapped inward, bent at impossible angles that spoke to tremendous downward pressure. But there were no footprints around the site, no signs of a struggle, nothing to indicate what kind of force could have flattened a properly staked tent without leaving some trace of its passage. The zipper door hung open, shredded fabric flapping in the morning breeze. Inside, Jess's sleeping bag was empty, still zipped, but stained with something dark that I hoped was mud, but feared was blood. Her gear was scattered, water bottles crushed, first aid kit torn open, emergency radio smashed into electronic fragments. Whatever had taken her had been thorough, almost methodical in its destruction. But it was the hemlock tree 15 feet from the tent that made my blood run cold. Deep gouges scored the bark in parallel lines, each cut 6 inches long and curved slightly inward like massive claw marks. But the spacing was wrong for any bear or mountain lion. Too wide, too deep, and positioned too high on the trunk. The lowest mark started 12 feet up, as if something had been hanging from the tree and clawing at the bark in frustration or rage. I called search and rescue immediately, coordinating the response from Jess's destroyed campsite while trying not to contaminate any potential evidence. Within 2 hours, we had dogs and drones in the air, thermal imaging cameras sweeping the forest, and a full team of searchers combing every square yard of terrain. But the dogs acted strangely, whining and pulling away from certain areas, as if they'd encountered a scent that triggered their deepest evolutionary fears. The drone pilots reported equipment malfunctions, compasses spinning wildly, GPS signals dropping out, camera feeds filled with static whenever they flew over certain sections of the forest. Robert, the lead pilot, was a 10-year veteran who'd flown military reconnaissance missions in Afghanistan. I'd never seen him look rattled by technical problems, but standing there watching his expensive drone crash into the canopy for no apparent reason, he looked genuinely spooked. "Something's interfering with the electronics," he said, studying the twisted wreckage we'd retrieved from a treetop. "But I've never seen interference patterns like this. It's almost like something was jamming the signals deliberately." I kept a foot search going while the technical teams tried to solve their equipment problems. Moving through the forest felt different now, heavier somehow, as if the air itself had thickened. The usual woodland sounds seemed muffled and distorted. Birds called from the wrong directions. Small animals moved with urgent purpose, all of them heading away from the search area as if fleeing some approaching disaster. The dogs lost Jess's scent at an abandoned percussion charge mine shaft above the Kaymore climbing ladders, a relic from the coal mining operations that had scarred this area in the early 1900s. The shaft entrance was partially collapsed, blocked by decades of fallen leaves and debris, but there was a gap large enough for a person to squeeze through. The opening exhaled a steady stream of cool air that tasted of copper pennies and something else, something organic and unpleasant that made me want to breathe through my mouth. "I wouldn't go down there if I were you," said Walter, the SAR team leader. He'd been working search and rescue in the Appalachian region for over 30 years, and there was something in his weathered face that spoke of hard-won wisdom. Some of these old mines connect to cave systems that go on for miles, easy to get lost, easier to get dead, but Jess was down there somewhere, and she was my responsibility. Against Walter's advice and probably against my better judgment, I clipped on a safety line and squeezed through the narrow opening into the abandoned mine. Inside, the air tasted like copper pennies mixed with something fouler, the sweet, cloying scent of organic decay that seemed to coat the inside of my mouth. My headlamp beam cut through absolute darkness, revealing a low tunnel carved from black shale. Water trickled down the walls, leaving mineral stains that looked disturbingly like dried blood in the yellow light. The tunnel stretched ahead into darkness, gradually descending deeper into the earth. 10 yards in, I found Jess's radio on a flat shelf of rock, smashed so thoroughly that the plastic casing had been ground to powder. Beside it, someone had sketched a salamander in what looked like red chalk or dried blood. The drawing was crude but unmistakable. Wide head, external gills, legs splayed beneath a serpentine body. Underneath, in shaky capitals, someone had written, "It crawls, it climbs." The words sent ice water through my veins. This wasn't random vandalism or the work of local teenagers looking for thrills. This was a warning, left by someone who'd encountered whatever lived down here and survived long enough to share what they'd learned. The chalk, or blood, was fresh, applied within the last day or two, maybe by Jess herself, if she'd had time to understand what she was facing. I pushed deeper into the tunnel, following the steady trickle of water and the increasingly foul smell that seemed to rise from the depths. The passage narrowed, then opened into a cavern that my headlamp couldn't fully illuminate. The air here was warm and humid, like breathing inside the mouth of some massive creature. Water dripped constantly from stalactites overhead, each drop echoing through the darkness with hollow, ringing sounds. My beam struck something on the far wall that made me freeze in terror. Slick, gray-black skin stretched over layers of muscle, clinging to the vertical rock face like some impossible fusion of tree frog and nightmare. The thing was massive, as tall as me, but built with an amphibian's powerful limbs, each one bent backward to provide purchase on the stone. Its tail was twice the length of its body, thick with muscle and ending in a paddle-shaped appendage that looked designed for both swimming and striking. The head turned slowly toward my light, revealing eyes that were set too wide apart, lidless and reflective like a cat's butt with vertical pupils that contracted to slits in the beam of my headlamp. External gill slits frilled along what I assumed was a jawline, pulsing rhythmically as the thing breathed through both air and the moisture-saturated atmosphere of the cave. A thin dorsal ridge ran from the back of its skull to the tip of its tail, covered in what looked like sensory organs that twitched and moved independently. For a moment that felt like an eternity. We stared at each other across the cavern. The creature's head tilted slightly, studying me with an intelligence that was alien but unmistakably present. This wasn't some mindless predator driven by instinct. This was something that thought, planned, calculated, something that had been watching the surface world and learning the habits of the creatures that lived there. Then it gave one slow click, two bones snapping together somewhere deep in its throat, and dropped from the wall with liquid grace. I leaped sideways as the creature landed exactly where I'd been standing, all four limbs splayed for balance while its massive tail whipped back and forth like a cat preparing to pounce. Up close, the smell was overwhelming. River mud mixed with hot copper and the sweet stench of partially digested meat. This close, I could see that its skin wasn't smooth like a typical amphibian's, but covered in tiny scales that shifted color in the light, providing natural camouflage against the cave walls. The mouth was the most horrifying feature, shovel-shaped and lined with rows of small conical teeth that were clearly optimized for holding rather than tearing. This wasn't built to kill quickly. It was designed to grab and swallow, to take its prey alive and whole. The thought of what Emily Nagel's final moments must have been like made my hands shake as I fumbled for my service weapon. I drew my sidearm and fired twice at center mass. Both rounds hit solidly, the reports deafeningly loud in the confined space of the cavern. The bullets struck the creature's hide and left dark dents but drew no blood. Its skin was apparently tough enough to stop small arms fire, or perhaps the rounds were simply absorbed by the thick. I broke into daylight, gasping and stumbling, my lungs burning from the sprint and the foul air of the cave. The Sayar crew gathered around the shaft, mouth-barked warnings when they saw what was following me up the tunnel, a darkness that seemed to move independently of any visible form, accompanied by clicking sounds that echoed up from the depths like the ticking of some hellish clock. The creature halted at the threshold of the shaft entrance, just inside the zone where daylight penetrated the opening. Its pupils, which had been narrow slits in the darkness, shrank to pinpoints in the sun. For a moment, it seemed confused, almost blinded by the natural light. Then it retreated with one last defiant clack of its internal bones, disappearing back into the depths with a sound like rushing water. District Command immediately quarantined the shaft, setting up a perimeter that kept civilian hikers and climbers well away from the area. They called in state biologists, herpetologists, cryptozoologists, anyone with letters after their name who might be able to explain what we'd encountered. Most of them scoffed at my report, dismissing it as stress-induced hallucination or misidentification of known species. Giant hellbenders don't climb vertical surfaces, said Dr. Michael Patterson, the state's leading expert on amphibian biology. Nothing that size can survive outside a stable aquatic environment with carefully controlled temperature and pH levels. And what you're describing, these supposed claws, hellbenders don't have claws. They have soft, fleshy toes adapted for swimming. But Dr. Patterson hadn't seen the claw marks on the hemlock, hadn't stared into those alien eyes or felt the intelligence behind them. He hadn't heard the calculating, almost musical quality of the clicking sounds that seemed designed to lure prey into dark spaces where escape was impossible. I couldn't shrug off what I'd experienced. Jess was somewhere down in those tunnels, and whether she was alive or dead, I wasn't going to abandon her to whatever was lurking in the depths. I returned alone the next dawn, armed with a flare gun, waterproof matches, and a digital tape recorder. Against direct orders from District Command and probably against every survival instinct I possessed, I was going back into that hellish cavern to find Jess. The creature had her, and I was the only one who'd seen it and lived to tell about it. That made me either the best qualified person to attempt a rescue, or the biggest fool in the state park system. The equipment I carried was deliberately chosen for the confined spaces and the creature's apparent light sensitivity. The flare gun would provide intense illumination that might blind or disorient something adapted to absolute darkness. The waterproof matches were backup in case the primary light source failed. The tape recorder was running constantly, documenting everything I encountered for whatever investigation might follow my probable death. The mine shaft entrance looked different in the early morning light, smaller somehow, more menacing. The gap I'd squeezed through the day before seemed to have narrowed overnight, as if the earth itself was trying to seal the opening. Cool air still exhaled from the depths, but now it carried a different smell, more organic, more immediate. The metallic scent of blood mixed with something that reminded me disturbingly of a reptile house at a zoo. I clipped on fresh batteries for my headlamp, checked my safety line one final time, and squeezed through the opening into the abandoned mine. The tunnel felt different now, charged with a malevolent energy that made the hair on my arm stand up. Water still trickled down the black shale walls, but the mineral deposits looked more like dried blood than ever. My footsteps echoed strangely, as if the sound was being absorbed and redirected by the stone itself. At the shelf where I'd found Jess's destroyed radio, the salamander drawing had changed. New details had been added in what looked like fresh blood, internal organs sketched with anatomical precision, reproductive structures that suggested whatever had drawn this understood the creature's biology far better than any surface-dwelling human should. The caption had been expanded too. It crawls, it climbs, it breeds. That last word sent ice through my veins. If this thing was reproducing, if there were others like it in the network of caves beneath the gorge, then Jess might already be beyond any help I could provide. But I pressed on, following wet footprints that led deeper into the cavern system, toward the warm, humid darkness that seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. The main cavern had changed too. My headlamp revealed pools of standing water I hadn't noticed before, fed by streams that seemed to flow upward from even deeper chambers. The water was the color of weak tea, stained by minerals and organic material that I didn't want to identify. Bioluminescent bacteria or fungi glowed faintly along the water's edge, providing just enough light to reveal movement beneath the surface, shapes too large and too purposeful to be fish. I followed the wet tracks around the edge of the largest pool, trying not to think about what might be watching me from the dark water. The prints were definitely human. Jess's hiking boots left distinctive tread marks in the mud, but they were accompanied by other impressions, long parallel grooves that could have been made by claws or webbed digits. Something had been walking beside her, or perhaps herding her toward some specific destination. The tracks led into a side passage I hadn't noticed during my first desperate flight from the creature. This tunnel was narrower but taller, carved by water action over millennia, into smooth, flowing shapes that resembled organic forms more than geological structures. The air grew warmer as I descended, heated by some source deep in the earth. Geothermal activity maybe, or simply the accumulated body heat of whatever was living down here. At the end of the passage, my headlamp revealed another pool, this one smaller but somehow more ominous than the others. The water was crystal clear, revealing a depth that my light couldn't penetrate. And there, on a natural ledge that jutted out over the water, lay Jess. She was unconscious but breathing, which was more than I'd dared hope for. But her lower leg was encased in a sticky, translucent film that looked disturbingly like frog spawn. The substance pulsed with its own rhythm, almost like a living thing, and where it contacted her skin, there were signs of chemical burns. Whatever this was, it wasn't just restraining her, it was slowly digesting her. I started toward the ledge, then froze as the water began to move. Something massive was rising from the depths, pushing aside gallons of liquid as it surfaced. The creature that emerged was the same one I'd encountered the day before, but now I could see it in its natural element. In the water, it moved with fluid grace, its powerful tail propelling it upward while its limbs stayed folded against its streamlined body. It placed itself deliberately between me and Jess, floating in the center of the pool with only its head and the ridge along its back visible above the surface. Its gill slits flared crimson, some kind of threat display that made the water around it shimmer with disturbed bioluminescence. Up close, I could see that its eyes weren't just reflective. They actually glowed with their own internal light, like the deep-sea creatures that never see the sun. Looking at this thing, remembering Emily's clean, severed remains, I finally understood what we were dealing with. This wasn't just some unknown amphibian species that had grown large in isolation. This was a specialized predator that had evolved in the flooded mine shafts, feeding on whatever fell or was dragged into its domain. It wanted the soft parts, brain tissue, organs, bone marrow, anything rich in calcium and phosphorus, nutrients that were scarce in the acid-washed environment of abandoned coal mines. The creature had been studying the surface world, learning the patterns of the creatures that lived there. It knew when climbers came down the approach trails. It knew where rangers camped and patrolled. It was smart enough to build warning markers, to lure prey into areas where escape was impossible, to keep them alive long enough for proper processing. I raised the flare gun, speaking as much to calm my own nerves as to communicate with the thing floating before me. Let her go. The creature's response was immediate and terrifying. It lunged forward with explosive power, propelling itself out of the water with its massive tail, while its limbs unfolded for the attack. I had perhaps half a second to react before those shovel-shaped jaws would close around my torso. I fired the flare gun directly into its face. The phosphorus charge exploded in a burst of white-hot light that turned the cavern into a temporary star. The creature shrieked, a sound like a boiling tea kettle mixed with the grinding of metal against stone. It thrashed wildly in the superheated air, its sensitive eyes apparently seared by the intensity of the flare. The chemical fire spread to the walls of the cavern, igniting deposits of organic material that had accumulated over decades. Rock overhead, heated beyond its structural limits, began to crack and splinter. A massive slab broke free and crashed down onto the creature's tail, pinning it against the bottom of the pool. Water rushed in from somewhere deeper in the cave system, carrying debris and stirring up sediment that had lain undisturbed for decades. I didn't wait to see if the creature would free itself. I grabbed Jess, slung her across my shoulders in a fireman's carry, and ran as the ceiling continued to collapse behind us. The gelatinous substance around her leg dissolved in the heat of the flare's aftermath, releasing a smell that made me gag even as I ran. Behind us, I could hear the creature's agonized cries mixing with the rumble of falling stone and rushing water. The trip back through the tunnel was a nightmare of noise and terror, my headlamp beam dancing wildly as I stumbled through the darkness with Jess's unconscious weight across my shoulders. At any moment I expected to feel claws raking down my back or jaws closing around my legs. But either the creature was too injured to pursue, or the collapsing tunnel had sealed it off in the depths where it belonged. I emerged from the mine shaft to find a medical helicopter already warming up on the plateau above. Someone, probably Walter, the SAR team leader, had called for immediate evacuation as soon as they'd seen me enter the tunnel. The paramedics took Jess from my arms and loaded her into the aircraft with practiced efficiency, starting IV lines and monitoring equipment even as the helicopter lifted off toward the regional medical center. I turned to find Frank, my supervisor, standing beside me with an expression I couldn't read. Relief that we'd recovered Jess alive, maybe, mixed with something else. Something that looked almost like resignation. "We knew something was in those tunnels," he said quietly, watching the helicopter disappear over the canyon rim. First report was back in 1975. 2 miners disappeared during the final cleanup operations. Company blamed methane gas, sealed the shafts, and walked away. We've been keeping people out ever since. Seemed like the cheapest solution. I stared at him, trying to process what he was telling me. You knew? You knew there was something down there and you didn't warn us? Frank looked older than his 58 years, worn down by decades of keeping dangerous secrets. The gorge lives on tourism, McCleary. Hard to sell rafting trips and rock climbing when there's a 6-foot amphibian hunting the cliffs. We thought we had it contained. I thought of Emily Nagel, her headless body floating in Devil's Creek. I thought of Jess, slowly being digested alive on that stone ledge. Contained wasn't the word I would have used. I filed my report anyway, documenting every detail of what I'd encountered in the abandoned mine. 2 weeks later, state geologists dynamited the shaft entrance, claiming unstable roof conditions made the area too dangerous for public access. The official statements mentioned structural concerns and environmental hazards but made no reference to cryptids or unknown species. The blast brought down several thousand tons of limestone and coal shale, sealing the entrance so thoroughly that nothing short of industrial mining equipment would ever reopen it. But I wasn't naive enough to believe that one explosion could seal off an entire cave system. Water finds a way, and so do the things that live in the dark spaces beneath the earth. Jess survived, though she lost her lower leg below the knee to whatever chemicals had been in that gelatinous cocoon. The doctors said she was lucky. Whatever had been dissolving her tissue had also prevented infection, creating a sterile environment that aided healing once the substance was neutralized. She was fitted with a prosthetic and eventually returned to active duty, though she requested a transfer to a park system in the desert southwest. Somewhere without caves, without abandoned mines, without dark water flowing through underground passages. The superintendent's explanation was clinical and bureaucratic, delivered in the same tone he might use to discuss budget allocations or maintenance schedules. But there was something in his eyes that suggested he'd been carrying this burden for longer than he cared to remember. The mining operations here ended in 1918, he said, spreading geological survey maps across his desk. But some of the deepest shafts were never properly sealed. When they flooded the galleries to control the methane fires, they created an entire ecosystem that was cut off from the surface world for decades. Things evolved down there, adapted to an environment that doesn't exist anywhere else on Earth. I studied the maps, trying to understand the full scope of what we were dealing with. The network of tunnels and natural caverns extended for miles beneath the gorge, connecting with underground rivers and limestone caves that had never been fully explored. What we'd encountered was probably just one individual from a population that might number in the dozens or hundreds. So we just ignore it? I asked. Pretend it doesn't exist and hope it stays underground? The superintendent closed the maps and locked them back in his filing cabinet. We contain it as best we can, keep people away from the known access points, monitor the area for any unusual activity, and hope that evolution continues to favor creatures that prefer the depths to the surface. But evolution isn't always so cooperative. Every spring since 2013, paddlers on the New River have reported strange encounters. Long shadows that keep pace with their rafts, moving beneath the dark water with purpose and intelligence. Shapes that vanish when the sun breaks through the morning mist, but leave wakes too large and too organized to be fish or debris. The sightings follow a pattern that makes my blood run cold. They cluster around the areas where underground streams connect to the main river, places where deep currents could carry things up from the flooded mine shafts. The descriptions are always similar. Something large and serpentine, moving against the current with powerful rhythmic strokes. Something that watches rafts and kayaks from below, studying the surface dwellers with an intelligence that speaks of long-term planning. I left the Park Service that winter, unable to continue working in a system that prioritized public relations over public safety. But leaving the gorge didn't free me from its influence. The dreams followed me to my new home in Virginia. Dreams of dark water and clicking sounds that echo through endless underground passages. Sometimes I wake to find my windows covered with that same oily moisture I'd noticed after my first encounter with the cairn, and I wonder if something has been marking me all these years. The archives tell a story that makes perfect sense once you understand what you're looking for. In 1915, a methane explosion in the Kmore mine sealed off an entire section of tunnels, trapping 73 workers in the lower galleries. The rescue efforts were hampered by continued fires and toxic gas, so they flooded the affected areas with river water, drowning the flames but also drowning any miners who might have survived the initial blast. The survivors, if there were any, spoke of strange lights in the smoke-filled tunnels, of sounds that weren't quite human echoing through the darkness. They described encounters with creatures that shouldn't have existed, things that had been changed by the toxic environment and the trauma of being buried alive. The rescue teams dismissed these accounts as hallucinations brought on by gas poisoning and extreme stress. But coal seams in that geological layer are rich in heavy metals and radioactive isotopes, creating conditions that could accelerate evolutionary processes in ways that surface environments never could. A population of eastern hellbenders, trapped in the flooded galleries and cut off from their natural habitat, might indeed grow to enormous size. They might develop new hunting strategies, new sensory capabilities, new levels of intelligence driven by the need to survive in an artificial ecosystem. By the time erosion and mining subsidence reopened connections to the surface, half a century later, only the strongest and most adaptable individuals would have survived. The female I encountered was probably the last of her generation, driven to the surface by receding groundwater levels and the need to find calcium-rich prey for egg production. She'd learned to hunt mammals because they provided nutrients faster and more efficiently than the blind crayfish and cavefish that had sustained her ancestors. We dynamited the most obvious entrance, but water always finds a way through limestone, and so do the things that live in the dark spaces between the rocks. The network of caves and abandoned mine shafts extends for hundreds of miles through the Appalachian region, connecting water systems that flow beneath multiple states. What we encountered in the new River Gorge was probably just the tip of a much larger iceberg. On nights when rain beats against my windows, I still hear the clicking. Two stones tapping together in the darkness, marking territory that extends far beyond what any map can show. The sound carries on the wind, following underground rivers that connect distant regions in ways that surface geography can't reveal. Sometimes I wonder if that female did lay her eggs before we sealed her tomb, and if somewhere in the flooded depths, a new generation is learning to hunt the surface world. The gorge is wide, and its secrets run deep. We like to think we've conquered the wilderness, mapped every square mile and cataloged every species. But there are still places where ancient things survive, adapted to environments we've forgotten how to see. Places where the line between evolution and nightmare becomes impossible to distinguish. I keep a loaded flare gun beside my bed now, and I never go camping near bodies of water that connect to cave systems. Because I know that somewhere in the dark spaces beneath the earth, something is still clicking its hollow song, still marking territory, still waiting for the right combination of circumstances to bring it back to the surface. The new River Gorge is a beautiful place, full of recreational opportunities and natural wonders that attract visitors from around the world. The Park Service does an excellent job of maintaining the trails, managing the climbing areas, and keeping the public safe from known hazards. But there are some dangers that don't appear on any trail map, some risks that can't be mitigated by warning signs or safety equipment. The water is wide, and the darkness beneath it is older than human civilization. In that darkness, things have been growing and changing and learning, waiting for their time to return to the surface world. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the river runs high and the mist rises from the canyon, I think that time might be coming sooner than we'd like to believe. The archives are public record, available to anyone willing to dig through decades of mining reports and geological surveys. The evidence is there for anyone who wants to see it, hidden in plain sight among the bureaucratic language of government documentation. But most people prefer comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths, especially when those truths suggest that we share this world with things that see us as nothing more than a convenient source of calcium and protein. I write this account not as a warning. Warnings imply that preparation is possible, that danger can be avoided through proper precautions. This is simply a record of what happened, what continues to happen, and what will probably happen again when conditions are right. The Earth is old, and life is persistent, and evolution doesn't always produce results that fit comfortably within our understanding of the natural world. The gorge keeps its secrets, but sometimes those secrets find their way to the surface. And when they do, all our maps and guidebooks and safety protocols become as useless as prayers whispered in the dark. I've been a ranger at Manitoga State Forest for 11 years, and I've learned that the woods have their own language. The rustle of leaves, the crack of branches, the distant calls of wildlife, they all tell stories if you know how to listen. But silence, real silence, is different. It's the forest holding its breath, waiting for something to pass. I should have paid attention the first time I heard it. My name doesn't matter much now. What matters is what I saw during those 72 hours in October, and why I'm writing this down before I hand in my resignation. The state will probably bury this report, call it stress or exhaustion, but I know what happened out there. I know what's still out there. Manitoga sprawls across 43,000 acres of dense forest in northern Wisconsin, a tangled maze of birch, maple, and ancient pine that predates European settlement by centuries. The Ojibwe called this place Manitoga, place of the spirits, and avoided certain areas entirely. When the logging companies came through in the 1890s, they found trees with symbols carved deep into the bark, warnings that loggers dismissed as superstition. Some of those trees still stand, grown thick around the scars, swallowing the warnings whole. The ranger station sits on the southern edge of the forest, a squat building of weathered timber with solar panels bolted to the roof and a radio antenna that only works when the weather cooperates. We cover the trails, issue permits, coordinate search and rescue operations, and try to keep tourists from doing stupid things like feeding bears or wandering off marked paths. Most days it's routine work. Most days. October 14th started normal enough. Dawn broke cold and gray, temperature hovering just above freezing with fog thick enough to muffle sound and reduce visibility to about 30 feet. I was reviewing trail reports when the call came through. A hiker, male, early 20s, hadn't checked in from a 3-day backcountry permit. His rental car was still parked at the Whispering Creek trailhead. His phone went straight to voicemail. His name was Dennis Kowalsski, a graduate student from Milwaukee studying forest ecology. His permit listed him as experienced, properly equipped, and following a planned route along the Northern Ridge Trail with an overnight stop at Mirror Lake. He was 2 days overdue. I gathered my pack first aid kit, emergency blanket, water purification tablets, rope, flares, GPS unit, spare batteries, and my grandfather's hunting knife. I radioed my position to Sandra back at the station and headed out just after 8 a.m. The Whispering Creek Trail starts easy, a well-maintained path through mixed hardwoods with occasional markers nailed to trees every quarter mile. But the farther you go, the wilder it gets. By mile 3, the trail narrows to a deer path, and by mile 5, you're navigating by compass and instinct through terrain that hasn't changed much in 10,000 years. The fog clung to everything, beating on my jacket and turning the forest into a monochrome photograph. Sound behaved strangely in that kind of humidity, sometimes carrying voices from miles away, other times swallowing noise completely. I kept my pace steady, watching for broken branches, disturbed ground, any sign of passage. Around noon I found his first campsite. He'd pitched his tent properly, used a bear bag for food storage, even scattered his fire pit according to leave no trace protocols. But he'd left in a hurry. The tent was still there, stakes pulled half out of the ground, the entrance flap hanging open. His sleeping bag lay twisted inside, and I could see dark stains on the nylon fabric. Mud, I thought at first, until I touched it and my fingers came away sticky. Blood. Not much, maybe a tablespoon's worth, but enough to make my chest tighten. I searched the immediate area, moving in expanding circles from the campsite. 20 yards north, I found his backpack hanging from a tree branch about 8 feet up, the straps torn. The contents had spilled across the ground, a camp stove, freeze-dried meals, a dog-eared field guide to Wisconsin flora. His journal lay open to the last entry, the ink smeared by morning dew. The handwriting was cramped and hurried. Something wrong here. Woods too quiet, no birds since sunset. Thought I saw someone watching from the trees, but when I shined my light there was nothing. Just eyes reflecting, too high off the ground to be a deer. Going to pack up at first light and head back. Signal's dead, can't call out. The entry was dated October 12th. The night before last. I keyed my radio. Station, this is Ranger 7. Found Kowalski's campsite, abandoned. Signs of distress. Blood evidence. Continuing north toward Mirror Lake. Over. Static crackled back at me, Sandra's voice cutting in and out. Copy. Weather system, lose contact. Check in. Hour.
Then nothing but white noise.
I tried twice more. Got the same result, and clipped the radio back to my belt. The GPS still worked. Satellite signal didn't care about weather, but I was effectively alone out here until I got back to higher ground or the storm system passed. The trail to Mirror Lake climbed steadily through dense pine forest, the kind of old growth that blocked out the sky and turned midday into twilight. The fog had lifted slightly, but the temperature was dropping. I could see my breath, and ice was forming on the edges of puddles. I found the second sign about a mile from the lake, a boot print in soft mud deep and uneven like someone running. Then another, and another spaced far apart. Following them, I noticed something odd. The prints were erratic, zigzagging between trees, doubling back on themselves, panic running, the kind of sprint people do when they're not thinking about direction, just distance. But there were other prints too. Barefoot impressions, elongated and wrong somehow, the toes too long and the stride too wide. They paralleled Dennis's boots for a stretch, then crossed directly over them. Whatever made those prints had been following him. The tracks led to a rocky outcrop overlooking Mirror Lake, a pristine body of water about 200 yards across, ringed by white pine and fed by an underground spring that kept it crystal clear year-round. The lake had a reputation for strange disappearances. 3 people in the last 50 years, all solo hikers, all vanished without a trace. The Ojibwe stories said the lake was a thin place, where the boundary between worlds wore down. I stood at the edge of the outcrop, studying the lake below. The surface was absolutely still, reflecting the gray sky like polished obsidian. No wind, no ripples, and silent. I realized I hadn't heard a single bird call in over an hour, no squirrels chittering, no insects, just my own breathing and the creak of pine branches. That's when I saw the cabin. It sat on the far shore, barely visible through the trees, a structure that shouldn't have existed. This was protected wilderness, no development allowed for 100 years. But there it was, a small log building with a peaked roof and a stone chimney. Smoke curled from the top. I checked my map. Nothing. I checked the GPS. According to the satellite data, I was looking at empty forest. I made my way down to the shoreline, moving carefully over loose rocks and exposed roots. Up close, the cabin looked old but maintained, the logs dark with age but the chinking fresh. The windows were shuttered from the inside. A neat stack of split firewood leaned against the wall. The door was ajar. "Hello?" My voice sounded flat, absorbed by the trees. "Park service. Anyone home?" No answer. I pushed the door open with my boot. It swung inward without a sound, well-oiled hinges. The interior was a single room, maybe 15 feet square, with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, and a narrow bed frame with a bare mattress. Fresh ashes in the fireplace, still warm. A tin cup on the table, half full of water, but no sign of occupation, no personal effects, nothing to indicate who might be staying here. Then I saw the walls. Every surface was covered in carvings, symbols cut deep into the wood with a sharp blade. Some I recognized, Ojibwe pictographs for danger, death, boundary. Others were unfamiliar, geometric patterns that hurt to look at, like they couldn't decide what shape they were supposed to be. And all of them, every single symbol, had been carved from the inside. Someone had been trapped in here, cutting warnings into the walls. At the far end of the room near the bed, the carvings became frantic, overlapping layers of cuts that formed words in English. "Don't look at it. Don't let it touch you. It wears faces. Mirror is wrong." My skin prickled. I backed toward the door, keeping my eyes on the interior, and that's when I noticed the mirror. It hung opposite the entrance, an old-fashioned thing with a tarnished silver frame. The reflection showed the cabin interior exactly as it was: table, chairs, fireplace, me standing in the doorway. But the door behind me, the one I'd pushed open, was closed in the reflection. I turned. The real door stood open. I looked back at the mirror. Closed. I got out of that cabin fast, not quite running, but close. My grandfather had been full of stories about the old ways, things his grandmother told him about places you didn't go, and rules you didn't break. Never trust a mirror in the deep woods. Never answer if something calls your name 3 times. Never follow lights after dark. And never, under any circumstances, let something see you watching it. The light was fading, evening coming early, under the heavy cloud cover. I had maybe 2 hours before full dark. Not enough time to make it back to the station. I needed to set up camp, build a fire, wait for morning. But first I needed to find Dennis Kowalsski. I circled the lake, moving counterclockwise, watching the ground for tracks. The barefoot prints appeared again on the northern shore, fresh enough that water still seeped into the depressions. They led into the forest, moving parallel to a dry creek bed choked with dead leaves. I followed them for half a mile before I found him. He was sitting against a birch tree, legs extended, head tilted back like he was resting. His jacket was torn, his hands covered in scratches and dried blood. His eyes were open, staring up at the canopy. "Dennis?" I approached slowly, hand on my radio. "Dennis Kowalski? I'm a ranger. Can you hear me?" He didn't move, didn't blink. I knelt beside him, reached for his neck to check for a pulse. His skin was cold, body stiff, dead for hours, probably since morning. But there was no obvious cause, no major injuries, no signs of animal attack. Just those scratches on his hands, defensive wounds. Then I saw his feet, bare. Boots and socks missing. And the soles were worn raw, skin shredded like he'd run miles over rough ground. The same distinctive prints I'd been following. My hand froze on his neck. If Dennis had been dead since morning, then who or what had made those fresh tracks by the lake? Something moved in my peripheral vision. I snapped my head around, saw nothing but trees and shadows, but I felt it now, the weight of attention, the sensation of being observed by something patient and hungry. The woods had gone completely silent. I stood slowly, backing away from the body, every instinct screaming at me to run. But running gets you killed in situations like this. Running triggers a chase response. Instead, I moved deliberately, keeping my back to the thick birch trunk, eyes scanning the darkening forest. That's when I heard it. A voice, distant but clear, calling from somewhere near the lake. Hey, is someone there? I'm lost. Please help." My voice. My exact voice, with the same inflection I'd used calling into the cabin. The thing that had been following Dennis had learned to mimic human speech, and it was calling me back to the water. I started moving, not toward the lake but perpendicular to it, heading west toward higher ground. The voice called again, closer now, and I could hear branches breaking, something large pushing through the undergrowth, not running, walking, matching my pace exactly, staying just out of sight. "Please, I can see your light. Don't leave me out here." The sun dropped below the horizon, and the forest plunged into darkness so complete I had to fumble for my flashlight. The beam cut through the black, illuminating tree trunks and undergrowth, but creating pockets of impenetrable shadow. Everything outside that narrow cone of light ceased to exist. I kept walking, compass in one hand, flashlight in the other, trying to maintain a straight line west. Behind me, the voice had stopped calling. That was worse somehow. At least when it was making noise, I knew where it was. Ahead, I saw a flicker of orange light between the trees. Firelight. I approached cautiously and found a small clearing where someone had built a campfire, the flames dancing in a carefully constructed stone ring. A tent stood nearby, stakes driven deep, the rain fly properly secured. My tent, my equipment. The exact setup I'd left behind at the trailhead this morning but somehow transported here miles into the wilderness. I swept my flashlight around the clearing. My backpack sat propped against a log. My sleeping bag was laid out inside the tent. Even my spare clothes were folded neatly beside the fire. It was perfect. A safe, warm camp waiting for me. Everything my exhausted brain wanted to believe was real. But I hadn't set this up. I'd been carrying my pack the entire day. Which meant something had arranged this, something that wanted me to stay. I heard footsteps behind me, slow and measured. I spun, flashlight up, and saw a figure standing at the edge of the clearing, man-shaped, roughly my height, wearing clothes that looked like they were made from shadow and bark. The face was wrong, too smooth, features slightly off-center, like a photograph printed on rubber and stretched. It was wearing Dennis Kowalski's face. The mouth moved, and my voice came out. Thank God. I thought I was alone out here. Did you find him? Did you find me? I ran. The smell hit me first, rotting copper, thick enough to taste. I'd been a ranger at Nahanni Lake Station for 11 years, and I'd found my share of bodies in these woods. Hikers who'd slipped on wet granite, hunters who'd misjudged the cold, even a kid once who'd wandered off from a campsite and simply stopped walking. But this was different. This was wrong in a way that made my stomach clench before I even saw what was left. I need to tell you this straight, the way it happened, because if I don't get it down exactly right, you won't believe me. Hell, I barely believe it myself, and I was there. I saw what I saw. My name's Marcus Webb, and I've spent most of my adult life in these mountains, in this specific stretch of wilderness that straddles the border between Montana and the Blackfeet Reservation. People get lost out here all the time. The forest is dense, the terrain unforgiving, and cell service is a joke. Most of the time we find them. Sometimes we don't. 3 days before I found the body, a family had reported their son missing. Troy Hendricks, 23, experienced hiker, Eagle Scout, the whole 9 yards. He'd gone out alone on a day hike along the eastern shore of the lake, something he'd done a dozen times before according to his parents. When he didn't come back by nightfall, they called it in. I started the search at dawn with 2 other rangers, Miguel Reyes and Vanessa Kurtz. We worked in a grid pattern moving out from Troy's last known position. The first day turned up nothing. The second day we found his backpack hanging from a branch about 8 feet off the ground. Not on the ground where it might have fallen. Hanging. The straps were looped over the branch deliberately, like someone had placed it there. Inside, water bottle, granola bars, first aid kit, phone with a dead battery, everything you'd expect, everything except Troy. Miguel radioed it in. While Vanessa and I expanded the search radius, that's when the weather turned. Fog rolled in off the lake, the kind that reduces visibility to maybe 10 feet. We marked our position and headed back to the station. Protocol says you don't search in conditions like that. Protocol exists for a reason. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not unusual during a search and rescue operation, but this felt different. I kept thinking about that backpack, the way it had been hung up so carefully. Troy's parents said he was responsible, careful, prepared. He wouldn't have just abandoned his gear, and if something had happened to him, an injury, an animal attack, the backpack would have been on the ground, maybe scattered, not hung up like a trophy. The third day we went back out. The fog had lifted enough to continue, though the whole forest had this muffled quality, sounds dampened and strange. We were working our way through a dense section of pine and spruce when Vanessa stopped dead. "You hear that?" I listened. At first, nothing. Then I caught it, a rhythmic creaking like a door swinging on rusted hinges. We followed the sound for maybe 50 yards until we came to a small clearing. Troy Hendricks was hanging from a tree. Not by a rope, by his own jacket, threaded through the branches in a way that made no physical sense. His body swayed slightly in the breeze, creating that creaking sound. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was his legs. They were on backward. I don't mean broken or twisted. I mean the knees bent the wrong way, the feet pointing behind him, like someone had unscrewed them and put them back wrong. His arms were the same. Everything rotated 180 degrees, and his face, Jesus, his face was untouched, peaceful even, eyes closed like he was sleeping. But there were marks on his neck, on his wrists, deep grooves that didn't match any animal I knew. Miguel threw up. Vanessa just stood there, her hand over her mouth. I got on the radio and called it in, trying to keep my voice steady, trying to describe what I was seeing in words that made sense. The dispatcher asked me to repeat myself 3 times. We cut him down. We had to. We couldn't just leave him hanging there. As soon as his body touched the ground, I saw them tracks in the soft earth around the tree. Bare footprints, human-sized, but the toes were too long and the heel too narrow. They circled the tree in a perfect spiral, dozens of them, overlapping and fresh. And they led away into the woods, toward the old Firewatch cabin about 2 miles north of our position. The cabin had been abandoned for 30 years, maybe more. The Forestry Service had built a new tower on the ridge in the 80s, and the old structure had been left to rot. I'd been inside it exactly once during my first year as a ranger, and I'd felt such an immediate visceral wrongness that I'd turned around and left. I'd told myself it was just the creepiness of an abandoned building, the way decay and isolation can mess with your head, but I'd never gone back. Now these tracks were leading straight toward it. We waited with the body until the county medical examiner arrived with a team. They took statements, photographs, measurements. The ME, a severe woman named Dr. Patricia Sims, examined Troy's body on site. After about 20 minutes, she pulled me aside. "The joints have been disarticulated and reconstructed," she said, her voice clinical but tight, surgically precise. "This would require hours of work, specialized knowledge of anatomy, and the victim would have to be immobilized but alive for most of it." "Why alive?" I asked, though I didn't want to know. "Because of the blood pattern. The heart was pumping when this was done." I felt my lunch trying to come back up. Could he have done this to himself, some kind of psychotic break? She gave me a look that said I was an idiot. No, someone did this to him. And whoever they are, they're still out here. The police set up a command center at our ranger station. State police, FBI, even some specialists from the tribal police, since we were so close to reservation land. They wanted to know about recent activity in the area, any unusual reports, any other missing persons. I told them about the cabin, about the tracks. They organized a team to check it out at first light. I should have left it at that, should have let them handle it. But that night alone in my quarters at the station, I kept thinking about those footprints, about the way they'd spiraled around that tree, about the old stories my grandmother used to tell, back before she passed. She'd been Blackfeet, grew up on the reservation, and she'd had stories about things that lived in these mountains, things that wore human skin but weren't human underneath, things that could move like animals and think like men. She called them Yi-Nal-Blushi, skinwalkers. I'd always figured they were just campfire tales, the kind of stories every culture has to explain the unexplainable. But sitting there in the dark, listening to the wind move through the pines outside my window, I wasn't so sure anymore. Around midnight, I made a decision I knew was stupid. I grabbed my flashlight, my service weapon, and my radio, and I headed out toward the cabin. I told myself I was just going to scout it, get a look before the official team went in, maybe find something that would help them understand what they were dealing with. The truth is, I needed to know, needed to see for myself. The trail to the cabin was overgrown, barely visible even with the flashlight. I'd marked the route on my GPS, but the device kept glitching, the screen flickering and showing impossible locations. One minute I was right on track, the next it claimed I was 3 miles underwater in the lake. Eventually I just turned it off and navigated by memory and instinct. The forest was alive with sound. Branches cracking, leaves rustling, the distant call of an owl. Normal sounds, but they felt wrong, orchestrated, like something was pacing me just out of sight. Twice I spun around, certain I'd heard footsteps behind me. Nothing there, just darkness and trees. It took me 45 minutes to reach the cabin. It sat in a small depression, surrounded by thick stands of pine that blocked most of the moonlight. The structure was in worse shape than I remembered, the roof sagging, windows broken out, the door hanging crooked on its hinges. But there was light inside, not electric light, flickering orange, like a fire. I drew my weapon and approached slowly, keeping low. As I got closer, I could see movement through the broken windows, shadows dancing on the walls, and I could hear something, not words exactly, but a kind of rhythmic vocalization, rising and falling in pitch. I reached the door and peered inside. The interior was a single room, maybe 20 by 20 feet. In the center, someone had built a fire in what used to be the old wood stove, though the stove door was torn off and the flames spilled out onto the floor. The boards should have been burning, but they weren't. The fire just sat there, contained by nothing, burning without fuel. Around the fire were bones. Human bones arranged in patterns that hurt to look at, geometric and wrong. And in the center of it all, crouched on all fours like an animal, was something wearing Troy Hendricks's skin. I don't mean metaphorically, I mean it had removed his skin face, torso, limbs, and was wearing it like a suit. The thing underneath was lean and ropey with muscle, gray-brown and hairless. Its hands were too long, fingers ending in thick black nails. Its real face was narrow and coyote-like, with yellow eyes that reflected the firelight. As I watched, frozen in the doorway, it reached down and picked up a bone, a femur, human, fresh, and cracked it open with its teeth. It sucked out the marrow with a wet slurping sound that made my skin crawl. Then it looked directly at me. I ran. I don't remember making the decision to run. Don't remember turning around. I just remember crashing through the underbrush, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind me I could hear it following, not running, loping like a wolf, its footfalls oddly silent on the forest floor. I'd made it maybe a quarter mile when I realized my radio was gone. Must have dropped it during the initial flight. My phone was in my pocket, but no signal out here. I was alone in the dark with that thing somewhere behind me. I found a thick stand of spruce and pressed myself into it, trying to control my breathing, trying to think. The forest had gone silent. No insects, no wind, nothing. Just my heartbeat, hammering in my ears. Then I heard it. That same rhythmic vocalization from the cabin, but closer now. Much closer. It was circling me, moving through the trees with impossible silence. And it was doing something with its voice. Something that made my head swim, and my vision blur. The sound wasn't coming from one direction. It was coming from everywhere at once. I pressed myself deeper into the spruce, the needles scraping my face. My finger was on the trigger of my weapon, though I had no idea if bullets would even slow this thing down. The vocalization grew louder, more complex, and I realized with a sick lurch that it was mimicking human speech, words I couldn't quite make out, phrases that seemed almost familiar. Then, silence. I waited, every muscle locked tight, sweat running down my back despite the cold. Nothing. No movement, no sound, just the terrible absence of noise that meant something was very, very close. A branch snapped directly above me. I looked up and saw it perched in the tree, still wearing Troy's skin, its yellow eyes fixed on my position. Its mouth opened, Troy's mouth, but the jaw unhinged like a snake's, and it spoke in Troy's voice. "Help me, please, it hurts so much." I fired. 3 shots, center mass. The thing jerked with each impact but didn't fall. Instead, it dropped from the tree and landed maybe 10 feet in front of me, crouched and ready to spring. The skin suit was torn where the bullets had hit, and I could see that gray-brown flesh underneath, could see the holes already closing up. "Please," it said again, still using Troy's voice. "Don't leave me here. Then it smiled, and I saw that it had too many teeth, row after row of them like a shark. I ran again, abandoning all stealth, just crashing through the forest as fast as my legs would carry me. I could hear it behind me, keeping pace easily, toying with me. Every few seconds it would call out in Troy's voice, begging for help, screaming in pain, sometimes laughing. I broke through into a clearing I recognized about half a mile from the ranger station. The eastern sky was starting to lighten. Dawn was coming. I pushed myself harder, my lungs burning, my legs screaming. The station lights were visible through the trees now. I was going to make it. Something hit me from behind, driving me face first into the dirt. The thing's weight crushed down on me, impossibly heavy. I felt its breath on the back of my neck, hot and rank. Those 2 long fingers dug into my shoulders, claws piercing skin. Then I heard a sound I never thought I'd be so happy to hear. A helicopter. The FBI team coming in early. Searchlights swept the forest, and I heard shouts, people moving through the trees. The weight lifted off me instantly. I rolled over and saw it retreating into the shadows, moving on all fours with horrifying speed, but at the edge of the clearing it stopped and looked back. Troy's face, or what was left of it, stared at me. Then the thing spoke one more time, but not in Troy's voice. In my grandmother's voice, words in Blackfeet that I only half understood. A warning. Or maybe a promise. Then it was gone. They found me lying in the clearing, covered in blood, some of it mine, most of it not. I told them everything, knowing how it would sound. They searched the cabin and found the bones, the fire pit, evidence that someone had been living there. But no skin suit, no creature. The bones went to the lab for analysis. I went on administrative leave for psychiatric evaluation. The official report called it a serial killer, possibly someone with extensive knowledge of Native American rituals and a severe psychological disorder. Troy Hendricks was the 4th victim. They found remains of 3 others buried around the cabin. The case is still open. They're still searching. But I know what I saw. I know what's out there, wearing stolen faces, walking on reversed legs, waiting in the dark spaces between the trees. And I know it's still watching the lake, watching the trails, watching for the next hiker who wanders too far from the path. I requested a transfer. It was denied. So now I stay in the station after dark, doors locked, gun loaded, and I wait for the day when I hear my own voice calling to me from the woods, begging myself to come out and help. Because that's when I'll know it's ready to add my skin to its collection. And there's nothing I can do to stop it. The call came through on my radio at 4:30 in the afternoon, just as the September sun began its descent behind the ridgeline of the San Juan Mountains. I'd been a ranger at the Weminuche Wilderness for 6 years, and I'd learned to trust my gut when something felt wrong. The voice on the other end belonged to dispatch, but beneath the professional tone, I caught the edge of concern that made my stomach tighten. Ranger Station. We've got a report of an overdue hiker. Male, mid-20s. Last seen yesterday morning heading toward the Vallecito Creek Trail. Name's Marcus Brennan. His girlfriend says he was supposed to be back last night. I copied down the details, my pen scratching against the incident report form I'd filled out too many times before. Most missing hikers turned up within hours, usually embarrassed and dehydrated, sometimes with a twisted ankle or a bruised ego from getting turned around on trails they swore they knew. But something about this one settled differently in my chest. Maybe it was the timing or the location. The Vallecito Creek area had been giving me an uneasy feeling for the past 2 weeks, ever since I'd found those deer carcasses arranged in a pattern that made no sense. 3 of them, gutted and placed in a perfect triangle, their heads all pointing inward toward nothing but bare earth. I grabbed my pack and checked the contents by habit: first aid kit, emergency blanket, water purification tablets, rope, flares, handheld GPS, and my service pistol loaded with rounds I hoped I'd never have to use on anything more threatening than a protective bear. The temperature would drop below freezing once the sun went down, and if Marcus Brennan was injured and immobile, hypothermia would become a bigger threat than whatever had gotten him lost in the first place. The drive to the trailhead took 40 minutes along roads that twisted through pine forests so dense they blocked out most of the fading daylight. I passed the last scattered homes of weekend cabin owners and seasonal residents, their windows already dark and shuttered for the approaching winter. This far into the backcountry, cell service was a fantasy, and the nearest hospital was 3 hours away on roads that turned treacherous with the first snow. I parked my truck and shouldered my pack, studying the trailhead kiosk where hikers were supposed to sign in and out. Marcus Brennan's name was there in hasty handwriting stamped with yesterday's date, but the sign-out column remained empty. The trail stretched ahead into gathering shadows, and I clicked on my headlamp even though I had maybe 20 minutes of usable daylight left. Moving through these woods after dark was asking for trouble, but waiting until morning meant abandoning someone who might not survive the night. The trail followed the creek for the first 2 miles, the sound of running water providing a constant backdrop to my footsteps. I called out Marcus's name every few minutes, listening for any response, but heard only the wind moving through the pines and the occasional crack of a branch that made me pause and scan the darkening forest. My breath came out in visible puffs, and I quickened my pace to keep my body temperature up. At the 3-mile marker, I found his backpack. It was lying just off the trail, partially hidden behind a fallen log, and that's when my unease transformed into something closer to dread. No experienced hiker abandons their gear unless something has gone seriously wrong. I knelt and examined the pack without touching it at first, noting how the zippers were all closed and the straps weren't torn or damaged. It looked like it had been carefully placed there rather than dropped in panic. I opened it and found everything a responsible day hiker should carry. Water bottles still half full, energy bars, a map of the area, a compass, extra layers of clothing. His wallet was in the front pocket with his ID and credit card still inside. Whatever had happened to Marcus Brennan, it hadn't been a simple case of getting lost and trying to lighten his load. The light was failing fast now, and I radioed back to dispatch with an update. The decision to continue or make camp for the night weighed on me, but the rules were clear. Solo search and rescue after dark in unfamiliar terrain was how you ended up with 2 missing people instead of 1. I started looking for a suitable spot to set up my emergency bivouac when I heard it. The sound came from deeper in the forest, off-trail where the undergrowth grew thick and tangled. It wasn't quite a scream and wasn't quite a cry for help. It was something in between. A human voice making sounds that seemed wrong somehow, like words being formed by something that didn't quite understand how speech worked. The hair on my arm stood up beneath my jacket sleeves. "Marcus," I called out, my hand instinctively moving to the pistol on my hip. "Marcus Brennan, is that you?" The sound came again, definitely closer this time, and I realized with growing horror that it was mimicking my voice. Not perfectly, but close enough that if I'd been farther away or less alert, I might have thought it was an echo. The mimicry had a wet, gurgling quality that made my skin crawl. I backed toward the trail, keeping my headlamp pointed in the direction of the sounds. The beam cut through the darkness and caught movement between the trees. Something large shifting position with an unsettling fluidity. For just a moment I thought I saw a human figure standing among the pines, but the proportions were wrong. The limbs were too long, the posture too angular, like someone had tried to imitate a person standing upright but gotten the details slightly off. My training kicked in, overriding the primal urge to run. I pulled out my radio and reported what I was seeing, keeping my voice steady even as my heart hammered against my ribs. Dispatch acknowledged and said they were sending backup, but backup was hours away, and whatever was watching me from the tree line wasn't going to wait for reinforcements. The thing moved again, circling around to my left, and I caught another glimpse of it in my headlamp's beam. This time I saw what might have been a face, pale and stretched, with eyes that reflected the light like an animal's. But no animal I knew moved like that, with such deliberate, calculating intent. I made the decision to retreat back down the trail toward my truck. Every instinct I had was screaming that I was being hunted, that something was treating me like prey, testing my reactions and looking for weakness. I walked backward for the first 100 yards, keeping my light trained on the forest, watching as shadows moved parallel to my position. The mimicry started again, but this time it was using Marcus Brennan's voice, or what I imagined his voice might sound like. It was calling for help, begging someone named Jennifer to come find him. Please, he was hurt, he couldn't move. The performance was almost perfect, filled with genuine-sounding pain and fear, and if I hadn't known better, I would have charged into those woods to save him. That's when I understood what had happened to Marcus. He'd heard those same cries, that same desperate pleading, and he'd done what any decent person would do. He'd followed the voice into the darkness, leaving his pack behind so he could move faster, more quietly. And whatever made those sounds had been waiting for exactly that response. I reached the 2-mile marker, and risked turning my back on the forest to move faster. Behind me, I heard footsteps, but they didn't sound quite right. The rhythm was off, like something walking on 4 legs trying to mimic the gait of a biped. I broke into a jog, my pack bouncing against my spine, my breath coming in ragged gasps that had nothing to do with exertion. The trailhead appeared ahead, my truck's white paint visible in the moonlight that had finally broken through the cloud cover. I fumbled for my keys with shaking hands, dropped them once, snatched them up and got the door open. The engine started on the first try, and I'd never been more grateful for reliable machinery in my life. As I pulled away, my headlights swept across the tree line one final time. Something was standing at the edge of the forest, tall and wrong, watching me leave. It raised one too long arm in what might have been a wave or might have been a threat. I didn't slow down to figure out which. The drive back to the ranger station was a blur, I filed my report, called in additional search teams for First Light, and tried to explain what I'd encountered in words that wouldn't get me labeled as unstable or unreliable. The supervisor who took my statement listened without comment, his face unreadable, and when I finished he just nodded and said they'd have 4 teams out at dawn. But I saw something in his eyes that told me I wasn't the first ranger to come back from those woods with a story about something that shouldn't exist, and I knew with cold certainty that Marcus Brennan was already dead. Dawn came with a frost that turned the world white and brittle. I'd managed maybe 2 hours of sleep, my mind replaying those sounds, that impossible figure moving through the trees. The coffee I'd made tasted like ash, but I drank it anyway, needing the caffeine to push through the exhaustion that sat heavy on my shoulders. The search teams assembled at the ranger station parking lot at 6 in the morning. 4 groups of 3, each with radios, medical supplies, and enough experience between them to handle most wilderness emergencies. I recognized most of the faces from previous searches, from training exercises, from the uncomfortable camaraderie that developed between people who regularly witnessed the worst outcomes of human decisions. My supervisor, a weathered man named Gordon who'd been working these mountains for 30 years, pulled me aside before the briefing. His face was deeply lined, carved by decades of sun and wind, and his eyes held a weariness that went beyond simple fatigue. "Tell me exactly what you saw last night," he said quietly, away from the others. No official bullshit, no careful wording. What was out there? I met his gaze and saw that he already knew. He'd seen it too, or heard about it from others who had. The unspoken understanding passed between us, and I told him everything. The mimicry, the wrong proportions, the way it had moved like it was wearing a human body that didn't quite fit. Gordon nodded slowly when I finished. "We've got protocols for this," he said, which surprised me. "They're not written down anywhere, and we don't talk about them in official channels, but they exist. You're going to be on my team today, and we're taking the Vallecito Creek Trail. The other teams will spread out, cover the surrounding areas, but you and I both know they're not going to find anything." "What about Marcus?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. We'll do everything by the book." But that young man walked into something that's been in these mountains longer than the Park Service, longer than the settlements, longer than most of the trees. The UT people who lived here first, they knew about it. They had names for it, rules about certain areas where you didn't go after dark, stories they told to keep their children from wandering too far from camp. The briefing was professional and thorough. Maps were distributed, search grids assigned, check-in times established. Nobody mentioned my report from the previous night beyond the basic facts that I'd found the missing hiker's backpack and encountered something that caused me to retreat. The other rangers accepted this without question, their faces showing the kind of neutral acceptance that came from working in places where strange things happened, and asking too many questions didn't change the outcome. We headed out in our assigned teams, and I found myself paired with Gordon and a younger ranger named Kyle who'd transferred from Yellowstone 6 months ago. Kyle had the eager competence of someone who still believed the rulebook covered every situation, and I felt a twinge of sympathy for the disillusionment that was probably coming his way. The hike to Marcus's abandoned backpack took us just under an hour. The pack was still where I'd left it, undisturbed by animals despite the food it contained. Gordon examined it with the same careful attention I'd used, then straightened up and looked into the forest where I'd heard those sounds. "Kyle, I want you to stay here with the radio," Gordon said. "Maintain contact with the other teams and keep your eyes on the trail. If anything comes out of those woods that isn't us, you get back to your vehicle and call for backup." Kyle started to protest that we weren't supposed to split up. That protocol required teams to stay together, but something in Gordon's tone made him swallow his objections. He positioned himself near the backpack with his radio in hand, trying to look confident and failing. Gordon and I pushed into the undergrowth, moving slowly and methodically, calling Marcus's name even though we both knew it was futile. The forest here felt different in daylight, less overtly threatening but somehow more oppressive. The trees grew close together, their branches interlocking overhead to block out most of the sky. The undergrowth was thick with deadfall and thorny bushes that caught at our clothing and made progress exhausting. We'd gone maybe half a mile when Gordon stopped and pointed. Ahead, barely visible through the vegetation, was a structure. It took me a moment to process what I was seeing because it was so unexpected. A cabin, old and weathered, standing in a small clearing surrounded by pines. The logs were dark with age, the roof sagging but still intact, and the single visible window was just an empty black square. "This isn't on any of the maps," I said, pulling out my GPS to confirm. "There's no record of any structures in this area." "There wouldn't be," Gordon replied. "This cabin's been here since before the wilderness designation, probably built by trappers or prospectors back in the 1800s. The Park Service knows about it, but we don't advertise its existence. People who find it usually don't stick around long enough to ask questions." We approached carefully, and with each step, the sense of wrongness intensified. The clearing around the cabin was too perfect, too circular, and nothing grew within its boundaries except dead grass. No saplings, no brush, nothing that suggested natural encroachment. The cabin itself seemed to lean slightly, as if the ground beneath it was unstable. The door hung open on rusted hinges, and from inside came a smell that made my eyes water. Death and decay, but underneath that was something else, something chemical and alien, that reminded me of the one time I'd had to clean up after a meth lab explosion in a backcountry campsite. Gordon pulled a bandana over his nose and mouth and motioned for me to do the same. We entered the cabin with our flashlights raised, and what we found inside would haunt my dreams for years to come. The interior was a single room, maybe 12 feet square, with a dirt floor and no furniture except for a rough wooden table against one wall. On that table were bones, not just scattered remains, but carefully arranged skeletons, laid out with the precision of a museum display. I counted 5 complete human skeletons, their bones cleaned and organized, and beside them were the partial remains of maybe a dozen more. But that wasn't the worst of it. Hanging from the rafters on crude hooks were skins, human skins, stretched and dried like leather, with the faces still attached and recognizable. I saw men and women, young and old, their features frozen in expressions that ranged from terror to confusion, and on a separate hook still dripping was a fresh addition that I recognized from the photo his girlfriend had provided. Marcus Brennan stared at me with empty eye sockets, his skin draped over the hook like a discarded coat. I staggered backward and would have fallen if Gordon hadn't caught my arm. He was pale beneath his tan, his jaw clenched tight, but he wasn't surprised. Horrified, yes, but not surprised. "We need to get out of here," he said urgently. "Right now. Don't touch anything. Don't look too closely. Just move." We backed toward the door, but before we could exit, we heard it. That same wet, wrong voice from the night before, but this time it was coming from inside the cabin with us. It spoke in Marcus's voice, perfect now, having had time to practice with his stolen vocal cords. "Help me," it said from the shadows in the corner we hadn't checked. "Please, I'm hurt. I can't move." The thing that stepped into our flashlight beams was wearing Marcus Brennan like a suit. The skin hung loose in places, stretched tight in others, and underneath I caught glimpses of something that glistened wetly in the artificial light. It moved toward us on joints that bent in directions joints shouldn't bend, and its mouth moved out of sync with the words it was speaking. Gordon's hand went to his pistol, but I grabbed his wrist. Some instinct told me that shooting this thing would be a mistake, that it wanted us to attack, that it was testing us the same way it had tested me the night before. "Walk," I whispered. "Don't run. Just walk backward and don't take your eyes off it." We retreated slowly, maintaining eye contact with the impossible thing that had been Marcus Brennan. It followed us to the doorway but stopped at the threshold, as if some invisible barrier prevented it from leaving the cabin during daylight hours. It stood there watching us with eyes that were too large for the face they inhabited, and I realized with sick certainty that this was what it did. It lured people into these woods, took their skins and wore them like masks while it waited for the next victim. We made it back to Kyle without being pursued, though I felt eyes on us the entire way. Gordon radioed the other teams and called off the search, citing hazardous conditions, and we evacuated the area with a speed that probably looked like panic to the other rangers. Kyle kept asking what we'd found, but Gordon just shook his head and said he'd explain later, somewhere with better cell service and witnesses. The drive back was silent except for the sound of Gordon's fingers drumming on the steering wheel, a nervous habit I'd never seen from him before. When we finally reached the ranger station, he pulled me aside again, while Kyle went to file preliminary reports. "You can't talk about what we saw," Gordon said flatly. "Not to Kyle, not to the other rangers, not in any official capacity. The Park Service has ways of dealing with this, but they involve federal agencies that operate in the shadows and ask questions later. Marcus Brennan will go down as missing and presumed dead. Eventually his body might turn up somewhere, but it won't be in that cabin. Someone has to do something," I protested. "That thing is still out there. It's going to kill again. It's been out there for decades, maybe longer. And yes, it will kill again because that's what it does. But trying to hunt it, trying to destroy it, that's how we lose more people. The old protocols exist for a reason. We mark the area as hazardous, we discourage hikers from using those trails, and we tell stories that make people think twice about wandering off the path. It's not ideal, but it's survival." I wanted to argue, wanted to demand a better solution, but the look in Gordon's eyes told me he'd had this exact conversation before, probably multiple times, and nothing had changed. The thing in the cabin was a permanent resident of these mountains, a predator that couldn't be eliminated without costs the Park Service wasn't willing to pay. That night I sat in my quarters and tried to process what I'd witnessed. The official story was already being constructed. Marcus Brennan had gotten lost, fallen, and succumbed to exposure. His body hadn't been recovered yet, but search efforts would continue for another week before being scaled back. His girlfriend would grieve, his family would demand answers, and eventually they would accept the incomplete explanation because the alternative was too horrible to contemplate. And somewhere out there in the darkness, wearing the face of a young man who just wanted to spend a day hiking in nature, something inhuman was waiting for its next opportunity to hunt. 3 days passed before I could bring myself to go back into the field. I'd requested desk duty, citing the emotional strain of the failed search, and Gordon had approved it without comment. But sitting in the ranger station, filing paperwork and answering phones, felt like hiding, and I'd never been good at hiding from problems. The dreams didn't help. Every night I saw Marcus Brennan's face, or what remained of it, staring at me with empty sockets. I heard that wet, mimicking voice calling for help, and I woke up in cold sweats, checking the corners of my room for shadows that moved wrong. On the 4th day, an old man showed up at the ranger station, asking to speak with whoever had led the search for the missing hiker. The receptionist tried to direct him to the public information officer, but he was insistent, and eventually Gordon emerged from his office to see what the commotion was about. The old man was Native American, probably in his 70s, with long gray hair pulled back in a traditional braid and a face that reminded me of eroded canyon walls, all sharp angles and deep lines. He wore modern clothing, jeans, a denim jacket, hiking boots, but there was something timeless about him that made the contemporary outfit seem like a costume. "I'm Joseph Broken Cloud," he said, his voice clear and strong despite his age. "And I know what you found in those woods because my grandfather found the same thing, and his grandfather before him. We need to talk, but not here. Too many ears, too many people who won't understand." Gordon and I exchanged glances, and I saw the internal debate playing out on his face. Policy said we shouldn't discuss ongoing investigations with civilians. Reality said this man might have information that could save lives. "There's a diner about 5 miles south," Gordon finally said. "We'll meet you there in 20 minutes. The diner was one of those roadside institutions that catered to truckers and tourists, with vinyl booths and a menu that hadn't changed since 1985. We took a corner booth away from the other customers, and Joseph ordered coffee in a tone that suggested he planned to be there a while. "The UT people called it Yi Na Lushi," Joseph began without preamble. "Your people bastardized the name into Skinwalker, which isn't quite right but close enough. It's not what you think, though. It's not a witch or a shapeshifter from tribal legend. Those stories came later, when people needed explanations for something they couldn't understand." "What is it?" I asked, leaning forward. "Old," Joseph said simply. "Older than the tribes, older than the mountains themselves, maybe. My grandfather said his people found evidence of it going back hundreds of generations. Cave paintings showing figures that wore the skins of men. Stories carved in rock about the thing that hunted in the dark places. It's been here since before humans walked upright, and it's learned to adapt." Gordon pulled out a small notebook, then hesitated. "Can I?" "Write what you want," Joseph interrupted. "Nobody's going to believe you anyway. That's part of how it survives. Every generation, a few people see it, a few people die, and the ones who survive convince themselves they must have been mistaken. The thing in those woods is probably one of the last of its kind, but one is enough." "How do we kill it?" I asked. Joseph's laugh was bitter. "You don't, you can't. My people tried for centuries. Fire doesn't work because it just sheds the skin it's wearing, and grows a new one from whoever it catches next. Bullets pass through it like water. It doesn't need to eat or sleep or breathe like we do. It exists to hunt, and it's very, very good at what it does." "There has to be a way," Gordon insisted. "There is," Joseph said quietly. "You starve it. The thing needs human skin to survive in this world. Without it, it's just formless, unable to interact with physical reality. So you keep people away from its territory. You mark the area as forbidden. You tell stories that make hikers think twice. You do whatever it takes to cut off its food supply. Eventually, maybe in another 100 years, it'll weaken enough that it can't maintain a physical form. But killing it directly? That's not possible." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a rolled piece of paper, spreading it on the table between us. It was a hand-drawn map, much more detailed than anything the Park Service had, showing the wilderness area with unusual markings and symbols. "The red areas are where it hunts most actively," Joseph explained, pointing to several circles on the map. "The cabin you found is the center of its territory, but it ranges in a radius of about 5 miles in any direction. The blue marks are what we call safe zones, places where the terrain or the trees create natural barriers it doesn't like to cross. Running water especially, it doesn't like crossing streams." "Why are you telling us this?" I asked. Joseph met my eyes, and I saw deep sadness there. "Because my grandson went missing 3 months ago. He was hiking with friends, split off from the group to take photos of wildlife, and never came back. The search teams didn't find anything. His parents are still hoping he'll turn up somewhere, but I know better. I know what happened to him, and I can't tell them the truth because they'd think I'd lost my mind. The weight of his grief filled the booth like a physical presence. Gordon reached across and gripped the old man's shoulder briefly, a gesture of understanding that transcended words. I can't stop it, Joseph continued, his voice thick with emotion, but I can try to keep it from taking anyone else. That's why I mapped its territory, why I share this information with people like you who've seen enough to believe. You have authority here, the ability to close trails, to redirect hikers. Use that authority. Save the people you can. We talked for another hour, Joseph sharing details his people had accumulated over generations. The thing was most active in autumn, right around the time when early snow started pushing wildlife to lower elevations. It preferred young victims but would take anyone it could lure into its territory. It was intelligent, patient, and capable of learning from its mistakes. It had been spotted wearing the same skin for years at a time, suggesting it could preserve its trophies when prey was scarce. When we finally parted ways, Joseph gave us his contact information and made us promise to call if we learned anything new. Gordon and I drove back to the ranger station in silence, both of us processing what we'd heard and trying to reconcile it with our understanding of reality. That evening, Gordon called me into his office and closed the door. On his desk was a file folder I'd never seen before, marked with a simple red X and no other identifying information. This is unofficial, he said, opening the folder to reveal reports dating back to the 1970s. Every major wilderness area in the country has one of these files. Unexplained disappearances, encounters that don't fit normal patterns, evidence of something that shouldn't exist. The Park Service keeps them buried because admitting the truth would cause mass panic and destroy the tourism industry these parks depend on. I scanned through the reports, recognizing locations from across the country. Olympic National Park, the Great Smoky Mountains, the Everglades. Each file describes similar patterns: missing hikers, found belongings, occasional sightings of something humanoid but wrong. And in the margins of several reports were handwritten notes suggesting the authors knew exactly what they were dealing with, but couldn't say so officially. We're going to close the Vallecito Creek Trail, Gordon said, indefinitely, citing hazardous conditions and pending environmental assessment. It won't stop everyone. There are always idiots who ignore warnings, but it'll reduce the traffic significantly. And we're going to establish new protocols for search and rescue in that sector. No solo responses, no operations after dark, mandatory check-ins every 30 minutes. It's not enough, I said, though I knew it was all we could do. No, it's not. But it's something. And sometimes something is all we get. I took the file home with me that night, reading through decades of encounters and near misses. Some of the reports were clinical, just facts and observations. Others were more personal, written by rangers who'd seen too much and needed to document it even if no one would believe them. I found entries describing the cabin, confirming it had been used by the thing for at least 50 years. I found witness statements from survivors who described being hunted through the woods by something wearing a human face. And I found a photograph tucked in the back of the file that made my blood run cold. It was black and white, taken sometime in the 1980s based on the quality and the dated clothing of the people in the frame. It showed a group of hikers posing at a trailhead, smiling for the camera. But standing behind them, partially obscured by trees, was a figure that didn't quite match the others. The proportions were wrong, the posture unnatural, and if you looked closely at its face you could see that the skin didn't quite fit right around the eyes. Someone had circled the figure in red ink and written in the margin, identified as David Morrison, reported missing 1979, found deceased 1983, photo taken 1981. The thing had been wearing David Morrison's skin for 2 years, walking among humans, perfecting its disguise, and nobody had noticed until it was too late. I put the file aside and tried to sleep, but the photograph kept flashing through my mind. Somewhere out there in the wilderness, the thing that had taken Marcus Brennan was doing the same thing, learning to be human, waiting for its next opportunity to hunt. And I was supposed to just accept that, to file reports and close trails and hope that was enough. But hope, I was learning, was a luxury we couldn't afford when dealing with something that had survived for millennia by being patient and adaptable. The thing in the woods had all the time in the world. We had only our fragile human lifespans, and the slim chance that maybe, just maybe, we could outlast it through careful vigilance and enforced ignorance. It wasn't enough, but it was all we had. 2 weeks passed before anyone else went missing, and when it happened, I felt the weight of inevitability settle over me like a shroud. The call came at dawn, a panicked report from a couple who'd been camping near Emerald Lake, about 3 miles from the cabin Gordon and I had found. They'd woken to find their tent unzipped, and their friend Jenna Reynolds missing, her sleeping bag empty, and her boots still inside the tent. Gordon assembled a team before the sun cleared the horizon. This time there were 6 of us, moving in pairs with strict orders to maintain visual contact at all times. The closed trail designation on Vallecito Creek had pushed hikers toward other areas, and Emerald Lake had become more popular as a result. We'd inadvertently funneled people into adjacent hunting grounds, and now someone was paying the price. The couple who'd reported Jenna missing were in their late 20s. Outdoors enthusiasts who'd done everything right. They'd filed a trip plan, carried proper equipment, and camped in a designated site. But none of that mattered when you were dealing with something that didn't follow natural laws. She was there when we went to sleep, the woman, Amanda, said through tears. We all zipped up our bags. We all went to sleep at the same time. I didn't hear anything. No screaming, no struggle, nothing. I just woke up and she was gone. Her boyfriend Derek sat beside her with his arm around her shoulders, looking shell-shocked. The tent wasn't damaged. The zipper was opened from the inside. It's like she just got up and walked out in the middle of the night. Gordon and I exchanged glances. We both knew what that meant. The thing had called to her, used a voice she trusted, and she'd followed it into the darkness willingly. We started the search at the campsite, working outward in expanding circles. The morning was cold enough that our breath came in clouds and frost crunched under our boots. The lake stretched out before us, dark and still, its surface reflecting the pine-covered mountains like black glass. The beauty of the setting made what we were searching for even more obscene. I was paired with a ranger named Vincent, a quiet man in his 40s who'd worked in wilderness areas across the Southwest. He moved with the careful precision of someone who'd learned not to take anything for granted in the backcountry. We'd been searching for maybe an hour when we found the first sign, a piece of fabric snagged on a branch, pale blue, matching the description of Jenna's nightshirt. It was dangling about 4 feet off the ground, suggesting she'd passed by in a hurry, not caring when the thorns caught her clothing. She was moving fast, Vincent observed, examining the surrounding vegetation. Branches broken here, and here. She was running. Or being chased, I added grimly. We followed the trail of disturbed vegetation deeper into the forest, moving away from the lake toward areas that became increasingly difficult to navigate. The trees grew denser, the undergrowth more tangled, and several times we had to radio our position to the other teams to ensure someone knew where we were. The trail led us to another clearing, this one natural rather than created, and in the center of that clearing was another structure. But this one was different from the cabin. It was older, built from stones that had been carefully stacked to create a small shelter maybe 6 feet across and tall enough to crawl into. The entrance was dark and uninviting, and around the perimeter were bones, animal bones, this time arranged in patterns that made my head hurt to look at them too closely. This isn't on any historical survey, Vincent said, pulling out his GPS. There's no record of Native American structures in this area. Because it's not a Native American structure, I replied, remembering what Joseph Brokencloud had told us. It's older than that, much older. We approached carefully, and I noticed something that made my stomach turn. The ground around the stone shelter was stained dark, and the smell coming from inside was familiar. Death and decay, mixed with that chemical wrongness I'd encountered in the cabin. Vincent was reaching for his flashlight when we heard it, a voice weak and pleading coming from inside the shelter. Help me, please, it hurts, I can't move. It was Jenna's voice, perfect in every detail, and if I hadn't known better, I would have rushed inside immediately. But I grabbed Vincent's arm before he could move forward. That's not her, I said quietly. It's the thing, it's trying to lure us in. Vincent's face went pale as understanding dawned. How long has it had her? Long enough to learn her voice. Maybe hours, maybe less. We backed away from the shelter, maintaining our distance while radioing the other teams. Gordon responded immediately, his voice tight with controlled urgency, and ordered everyone to converge on our location but stay back from the structure. The voice from inside changed tactics, becoming angry and accusatory. Why won't you help me? I'm hurt, don't you care? Please, it hurts so much. The performance was remarkable, filled with genuine-sounding pain and desperation. I found myself taking a step forward before catching myself, the instinct to help overriding my conscious knowledge that this wasn't human. Gordon arrived with the other teams, and we established a perimeter around the stone shelter at a distance of about 50 feet. The thing inside continued its attempts at manipulation, cycling through different emotional appeals. Sometimes it sobbed, sometimes it screamed, sometimes it bargained. It used Jenna's voice, then switched to what might have been Marcus Brennan's, then to voices I didn't recognize but that probably belonged to other victims. We need to draw it out, Gordon said quietly, studying the structure. We can't just leave it there. Joseph said it can't be killed. I reminded him. But it can be contained. If we can get it away from its territory, separate it from its hunting grounds, maybe we can trap it somewhere it can't hurt anyone. It was a desperate plan, but desperation was all we had. Gordon sent most of the team back to establish a safe zone near the lake, leaving just himself, Vincent, and me to implement whatever strategy we could devise. The thing had gone quiet inside the shelter, which was somehow worse than the constant pleading. I imagined it crouched in the darkness, watching us with eyes that didn't need light to see, calculating its next move. Fire, Vincent suggested suddenly. What if we smoke it out? Joseph said, fire doesn't work, I replied. It just sheds the skin and regrows. But it would force it to abandon Jenna's skin, right? And it takes time to prepare a new one. Maybe we could track it in its base form, see where it goes when it's vulnerable. It was risky, possibly stupid, but it was also the first proactive suggestion anyone had made. Gordon considered for a long moment, then nodded. We'll need accelerant, and we need to be ready to move fast. We spent the next hour preparing. Vincent hiked back to the vehicles to retrieve emergency flares and a container of camp fuel. Gordon and I gathered dry wood and positioned ourselves where we could observe multiple escape routes from the shelter. The thing inside remained silent, but I could feel its attention on us, patient and predatory. When Vincent returned, we didn't waste time. We soaked the gathered wood in camp fuel, positioned flares around the perimeter of the shelter, and Gordon gave the signal. The flames caught immediately, fed by the accelerant, and within minutes the entire area around the stone structure was engulfed in a wall of fire. The screaming started almost immediately. It used Jenna's voice, pleading and begging, describing in horrible detail how the flames were burning her skin, how she was dying, how this was our fault. The performance was so convincing that Vincent actually started forward before Gordon grabbed him. It's not her, Gordon said firmly. Whatever happened to Jenna Reynolds, she's already gone. The smoke grew thicker, and through the flames I caught glimpses of movement inside the shelter. Something was thrashing around, and the screaming changed quality, becoming less human and more like the wet gurgling sounds I'd heard that first night in the woods. Then it emerged. The thing that came out of the fire wasn't wearing Jenna's skin anymore. It had shed her like a discarded coat, and what remained was something my brain refused to fully process. It was roughly humanoid in shape but wrong in every detail. The skin was translucent and glistening, like something that lived in deep ocean trenches where no light reached. The limbs were too long, jointed in too many places, and it moved with a fluidity that made my eyes hurt to track. Where a face should have been was a smooth surface broken only by a vertical slit that opened and closed like a breathing wound. It ran, not away from us but toward the lake, moving with impossible speed through the undergrowth. We followed at a distance, trying to keep it in sight while maintaining enough separation to avoid becoming targets ourselves. The thing reached the shore of Emerald Lake, and didn't hesitate. It plunged into the water and disappeared beneath the surface with barely a ripple. We stood at the water's edge, breathing hard, watching for any sign of where it had gone. Did we just make it worse? Vincent asked, voicing the question we were all thinking. Gordon's radio crackled to life. One of the other teams, positioned on the far side of the lake, was reporting movement in the water. Then another call from the north shore describing something swimming beneath the surface. The thing was circling the lake, moving faster than any human swimmer could manage. And then it disappeared. The radio calls stopped, the water settled, and there was no further sign of the creature we'd forced into the open. We spent the rest of the day searching the area, checking the shelter, examining the shoreline. Inside the stone structure, we found the remains that confirmed our worst fears. Jenna Reynolds lay in the darkness, her body intact but her skin missing, peeled away with surgical precision. Her face was frozen in an expression of terror, and I had to turn away before I lost what little breakfast I'd managed to force down that morning. Gordon called in the death through official channels, reporting it as an animal attack with severe trauma. The other rangers who processed the scene knew enough not to ask too many questions. Jenna's body was removed, her family notified, and the investigation quietly buried under layers of bureaucratic obfuscation. That night, as I sat in my quarters trying to process what we'd done, my phone rang. It was Joseph Broken Cloud. I heard about what happened at the lake, he said without preamble. You forced it into the water. We didn't know what else to do. The lake is deep, very deep, and it connects to underground systems we've never fully mapped. My people have stories about what lives in those waters, things even older than the Skinwalker. You may have solved one problem only to create another. The line went quiet for a moment, then Joseph added, or maybe you gave it access to new hunting grounds we didn't know existed. Time will tell, but you should know that waters that are connected underground can surface in many places, if it can travel through those systems. He didn't finish the thought. He didn't need to. The implication was clear enough. We might have just freed the thing from its limited territory, given it access to a much larger hunting ground through the underground water systems that connected lakes and streams across hundreds of miles. I thanked Joseph for the warning and ended the call. Then I pulled out the file Gordon had given me and added a new entry, documenting everything that had happened at Emerald Lake. Future rangers deserved to know what we'd learned, even if they never fully believed it. Outside my window, the forest was dark and full of sounds that probably meant nothing but could mean everything. And somewhere beneath the surface of Emerald Lake, something ancient and hungry was exploring its new domain, learning new ways to hunt, adapting as it had adapted for millennia. We'd tried to fight back, we'd tried to be proactive, and we might have just made everything infinitely worse. The disappearances started 2 weeks after the incident at Emerald Lake, but they followed a new pattern that confirmed our worst fears. A fisherman vanished from Beaver Creek, 20 miles north. A kayaker went missing on Blue Mesa Reservoir, 40 miles west. A hunter disappeared from the Pine River Valley, 30 miles east. All of them near water, all of them in areas that had been safe for decades. Gordon called an emergency meeting with the senior rangers from across the region, and I found myself sitting in a conference room with 15 people who all had the same haunted look in their eyes. They'd all read the reports, they all knew what we were dealing with, and they all understood that we'd fundamentally altered the situation by forcing the creature into the water. "We need to establish new protocols," Gordon said, spreading maps across the conference table. "Every water system in the region needs to be monitored. Every disappearance near water gets treated as a potential encounter, and we need to warn people without causing mass panic." "How do we do that?" asked a ranger from the Black Canyon area. "We can't exactly put up signs saying, 'Warning, ancient shape-shifting predator may be using underground rivers.'" "We increase hazard warnings around water recreation," someone else suggested. "Talk about dangerous wildlife, unstable conditions, anything that makes people think twice before going alone." The discussion continued for hours, practical people trying to solve an impossible problem with mundane tools. We established communication networks, created reporting systems, and developed cover stories that could explain the pattern of disappearances without revealing the truth. It was inadequate, but it was something. I stayed behind after the meeting ended, helping Gordon clean up the maps and documents. He looked exhausted, older than I'd ever seen him. "This is my fault," he said quietly. "I approved the fire. I thought we were being smart." "We all agreed," I replied. "And we didn't have better options. The thing was going to keep hunting either way. But now it's hunting over a much larger area. How many people are going to die because we made the wrong call?" I didn't have an answer for that. We packed up in silence and headed for the parking lot. But before I reached my truck, I noticed a figure standing near the tree line. Joseph Broken Cloud stepped into the light, and I saw that he wasn't alone. Behind him were 3 other Native American elders, 2 men and a woman, all of similar age, and bearing the same weight of ancient knowledge. "We need to talk," Joseph said. "All of us, about how to fix what you've broken." We reconvened at the same diner we'd met at before, this time in a private room the owner let us use after hours. The 4 elders sat across from Gordon and me, their faces grave but not unkind. The woman spoke first, introducing herself as Margaret Silverhawk. "Our people have dealt with this thing for generations," she said. "We learned that containment was the only option, that forcing it into a corner or trying to destroy it only made things worse. You've learned the same lesson, but at a higher cost." "Can it be contained again?" Gordon asked. "Perhaps," said one of the men, who introduced himself as Thomas Whitebear. "But not in the same way. The creature has evolved, learned new behaviors. It knows now that water can be used for travel, for escape. That knowledge can't be unlearned." "There is a place," Joseph said slowly, as if weighing each word carefully, "deep in the most remote section of the wilderness. A cave system that my ancestors sealed off centuries ago because of what lived inside. They used methods passed down from even older peoples, techniques that involved earth and stone and water in specific combinations. The creature could be lured there and trapped, but it would require significant effort and considerable risk." "What kind of risk?" I asked. Margaret answered. "The kind where some of us might not come back. The creature needs to be drawn to the location, which means using bait. And once it's there, the sealing process takes time. Time during which it will be trying to escape, trying to take whoever is closest." The weight of what they were proposing settled over the room like a physical presence. They were talking about a deliberate confrontation, about putting themselves in harm's way to correct a mistake Gordon and I had made. "We can't ask you to do that," Gordon said firmly. "This is our responsibility." "It's everyone's responsibility," Thomas replied. "Your people, our people, all the innocent hikers and campers who don't know what they're walking into. The creature doesn't discriminate, and neither can we." We spent the next 3 hours planning. The elders described the cave system's location, deep in a section of the wilderness that had been designated as off-limits even to rangers. They explained the sealing ritual, which involved specific minerals found only in certain rock formations, combined with water from a particular spring, and earth from the site where the creature had made its first kill centuries ago. "How do you know where that is?" I asked. "Our oral histories," Margaret said, "passed down generation to generation with perfect fidelity. The location has been remembered for over 500 years, waiting for a time when this knowledge would be needed." The plan was complex and dangerous. We would need to gather materials from multiple locations across the wilderness, transport them to the cave system without alerting the creature, and then somehow lure it into position. The elders insisted that only they could perform the actual sealing, but they would need support from rangers who could handle logistics and provide backup if things went wrong. "When do we start?" Gordon asked. "Tomorrow," Joseph said. "The creature is still learning its new territory, still exploring the possibilities of water-based hunting. If we wait too long, it will establish new patterns, new safety zones. We have a small window where it's still vulnerable to misdirection." The next morning, we assembled a team of 8 people. The 4 elders, Gordon, myself, and 2 other rangers who'd had encounters with the creature and understood what we were facing. We split into groups, each responsible for gathering specific materials. Gordon and I were tasked with collecting earth from the ancient kill site, which according to Margaret's directions was located near a distinctive rock formation about 10 miles into the wilderness. The hike took most of the day. We followed landmarks described in oral histories, looking for signs that most modern hikers would never notice. A tree split by lightning in a specific way. A stream that ran over rocks arranged in a pattern. A slope where the vegetation changed abruptly from pine to aspen. We found the site in late afternoon. It was unmarked except for stones arranged in a circle, so weathered and moss-covered that they looked like natural formations. But when we cleared away the vegetation, we could see they'd been shaped by human hands, placed deliberately to mark something significant. Gordon pulled out a small shovel and began carefully collecting earth from inside the stone circle. As he worked, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Fresh tracks in the soft ground, too large to be human, with a spacing that suggested something with a very long stride. "We're not alone," I said quietly, pulling out my radio. "Gordon, we need to move, now." The attack came without warning. One moment the forest was quiet, except for the sound of Gordon's shovel. The next, something burst from the undergrowth, within human speed. It was wearing a skin I didn't recognize. A middle-aged man's face stretched over its alien features, and it moved with the predatory grace of something that had been hunting for millennia. Gordon didn't hesitate. He grabbed the bag of earth we'd collected and ran, trusting me to cover our retreat. I pulled my service weapon and fired 3 shots at the creature, knowing they would do nothing but hoping to buy us a few seconds. The bullets passed through it like it wasn't there, and it barely slowed, but it did change direction, focusing on me instead of Gordon, which had been the point. I turned and ran, crashing through the forest with the thing in pursuit, its breathing a wet rattling sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I made it maybe 100 yards before I tripped over a root and went down hard. The creature was on me instantly, and I got my first close look at what it really was beneath the stolen skin. The face I'd seen was just a mask, held in place by something that looked like cartilage and sinew. Underneath were structures that couldn't exist in nature, geometries that hurt to perceive, colors that didn't belong in the visible spectrum. It grabbed me with hands that had too many fingers, and I felt my shoulder dislocate under the pressure. Pain exploded through my left side, and I screamed, which probably saved my life. The scream attracted Gordon's attention, and he came crashing back through the undergrowth with his own weapon drawn. "Here," he shouted, firing his pistol to draw the creature's focus. "Over here." The thing released me and turned toward Gordon, and I saw my opening. I still had my emergency flare in my pocket, and I pulled it out with my good hand, struck it, and jammed it directly into the creature's exposed side where the stolen skin didn't quite cover everything. The reaction was immediate and violent. The creature shrieked, a sound that made my ears ring and my vision blur, and it released its grip on both of us. Smoke poured from where the flare was burning, and I smelled that chemical wrongness intensified to eye-watering levels. We ran. My shoulder was screaming in agony, but adrenaline carried me forward. Behind us, the creature's shrieks continued, and I heard it thrashing through the forest, but it wasn't pursuing. The flare had hurt it somehow, maybe because it burned hot enough to damage the underlying structures that the bullets couldn't touch. We made it back to the trail and rendezvoused with the others at the designated meeting point. Margaret examined my shoulder with experienced hands, confirmed it was dislocated, and reset it with an efficiency that suggested she'd done this many times before. The pain was blinding but brief, and once it subsided I could move the arm again, albeit gingerly. "The fire hurts it," I gasped out, explaining what had happened. Not regular fire, but the chemical burn from the flare. It actually reacted. The elders exchanged significant glances. "Phosphorus," Thomas said. The flares contain phosphorus compounds. That's one of the minerals we need for the sealing. We had everything we needed now. The earth from the ancient kill site, water from the specified spring, rocks containing the right mineral compositions, and the knowledge that phosphorus-based fire could actually affect the creature. The trap was set. All that remained was to lure the prey into it. The cave system where the sealing would take place was a 3-hour hike from our current position, most of it through terrain that barely qualified as hiking. We moved carefully, each person carrying part of the ritual materials, maintaining silence to avoid alerting the creature to our plans. We reached the cave entrance just as the sun was setting. The opening was narrow, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through, but it opened into a larger chamber about 30 feet across. The walls were covered in petroglyphs that predated any known Native American culture in the region. Symbols and images that suggested the people who created them had been trying to trap something, to seal it away forever. Margaret and the other elders began preparing the ritual while Gordon and I set up our backup plan. We positioned phosphorus flares around the perimeter of the chamber, ready to be lit if the creature tried to escape before the sealing was complete. The rangers who'd come with us established a defensive perimeter outside, ready to deal with any hikers who might wander into the area. "Now comes the hard part," Joseph said quietly. "We need to bring it here, and the only way to do that is to offer it something at once." "Bait," I said, understanding. "You need bait." "Yes. Someone it will recognize, someone who's encountered it before and survived. It will want to finish what it started." Gordon and I looked at each other, and I saw the same grim determination in his eyes that I felt in my chest. We'd made the mistake that had freed this thing from its limited territory. We were the ones who needed to fix it. "I'll do it," I said. "We'll both do it," Gordon corrected. "It's seen both of us. It'll recognize both of us. We go together or not at all." The elders didn't argue. They simply nodded and continued their preparations, mixing earth and water and crushed minerals in patterns that followed geometries I didn't understand. The symbols they drew on the cave floor glowed faintly in the fading light, though I couldn't identify the source of the luminescence. Gordon and I took positions near the cave entrance and waited. We didn't have to wait long. The creature came with the darkness, moving through the forest with purpose. It had discarded the middle-aged man's skin and found a new one, a young woman's face that I recognized from one of the missing person reports, a kayaker who disappeared from Blue Mesa Reservoir 3 days ago. The skin was fresh, still fitting properly, and the thing wore it with obscene confidence. "Hello," it called in the woman's voice. "Is anyone there? I'm lost. Please, I need help." The mimicry was perfect, desperate and convincing. If I hadn't known better, I would have rushed to assist, but I did know better, and I stayed in position, waiting for it to get closer. It spotted us near the cave entrance, and changed tactics. The voice became Gordon's, then mine, then a combination of both. Calling out names and phrases it must have learned from our radio communications. The performance was remarkable and deeply unsettling. When it was close enough, Gordon and I lit our flares and showed ourselves. The creature's reaction was immediate. It recognized us, and whatever passed for emotion in its alien consciousness focused into something like rage. It charged. We ran into the cave, leading it exactly where we needed it to go. The thing followed without hesitation, probably thinking it had us trapped, not realizing it was walking into a trap of its own. The moment it crossed the threshold into the main chamber, the elders activated their ritual. The symbols on the floor blazed with sudden light, and the air itself seemed to crystallize into invisible walls. The creature slammed into the barrier with enough force to shake loose rocks from the ceiling, and its shriek of fury and confusion made my teeth ache. Margaret began chanting in a language I didn't recognize, joined by the other elders in harmonies that created overtones I could feel in my bones. They poured the prepared mixture onto the symbols, and where it touched, the light intensified. The creature tried to escape, shedding its stolen skin to reveal its true form, that translucent nightmare of impossible anatomy. It threw itself against the barriers again and again, and I could see them weakening with each impact, the light flickering. "Now," Joseph shouted, and Gordon and I lit every remaining flare we had, throwing them into the chamber where the creature thrashed. The phosphorus burned with intense heat and brilliant light, and where it touched the creature's true form, smoke poured out and the thing's shrieks reached new levels of agony. The ritual continued, the elders' voices rising in intensity, and slowly the barriers solidified. Stone began to grow from the cave floor, wrapping around the creature's limbs, pulling it down. The thing fought with desperate strength, but the stone was inexorable, spreading across its body like living rock. It took 3 hours. 3 hours of continuous chanting, of maintaining the ritual, of adding phosphorus to keep the creature weak enough that it couldn't break free. By the time it was over, the creature was completely encased in stone that had merged seamlessly with the cave floor, creating what looked like a natural rock formation. The elders collapsed in exhaustion, and we carried them out of the cave one by one. Margaret was the last to leave, and she paused at the entrance to mark the opening with symbols similar to those on the chamber floor. "This will hold for generations," she said quietly, "but not forever. Someday someone will have to do this again. Make sure the knowledge is preserved. Make sure future rangers know what's here and why it must never be disturbed." We sealed the cave entrance with rocks and vegetation, making it look as natural as possible. The location was marked on maps that would be stored in secure files, accessible only to senior rangers who'd proven they could handle the truth. And I added a detailed report to the file Gordon had shown me, documenting everything that had happened and everything we'd learned. 3 months have passed since that night. The disappearances around water systems have stopped. The wilderness has returned to its normal rhythms of predator and prey, of beauty and danger that follow natural laws. Hikers come and go, never knowing how close they came to something that shouldn't exist. But I know, and every time I lead a search and rescue operation, every time someone goes missing in the backcountry, I wonder if this is the one where we'll discover that the sealing has failed, that the creature has found a way out, that we'll have to face it again. Gordon retired a month ago, citing health concerns that were really just exhaustion from carrying too many secrets for too long. I've taken over his position as senior ranger, and with it the responsibility of maintaining those secrets. Joseph Broken Cloud calls me once a month to check in, to share information, to make sure the knowledge isn't lost. And sometimes, late at night when I'm alone in my quarters, I think about all the other wilderness areas across the country, all the files marked with red X's, all the rangers who carry similar burdens, all the things that exist in the spaces we've designated as wild and remote. We protect people from those things, but we also protect those things from people, maintaining a balance that's older than our civilization and more fragile than anyone realizes. The forest outside my window is dark and full of sounds that probably mean nothing but could mean everything. And I sit here with my reports and my maps and my burden of knowledge, knowing that somewhere out there, in caves and cabins and hidden places we haven't found yet, other things are waiting. Waiting for us to make a mistake. Waiting for us to forget. Waiting for their chance to hunt again. But tonight at least, the wilderness is quiet, and that's enough.